On a morning 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, before any alphabet existed to record it, before any empire had risen to claim it, before any god had been given a name that would survive to reach our ears, a woman knelt in brown earth beside a river and pressed a seed into the ground. We do not know her name. We will never know her name. She left no text, no inscription, no monument that bears a signature. What she left was a small, deliberate depression in the soil of the Jordan Valley, and in that depression a grain of emmer wheat, and around that grain the first faint evidence that human beings had decided to stop wandering and stay. The land where she knelt was not yet called anything. Not Palestine, not Israel, not Canaan, not the Holy Land. It was a narrow strip of earth running roughly 150 miles from north to south and perhaps 70 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. Smaller than Belgium, smaller than Massachusetts, barely a pencil mark on the globe. To its west, the sea. To its east, the river, and then the desert. To its north, mountains that climb toward what would one day be Lebanon. To its south, the dry expanse of the Negev, fading toward the copper-colored mountains of Sinai. It was by any geographic measure a small place, a sliver, a margin between water and sand. It would become the most contested land on earth. The woman pressing seeds into that soil could not have known this. She could not have known that the patch of ground beneath her knees would be fought over by Egyptians and Babylonians, by Persians and Greeks, by Romans and Arabs, by Crusaders in iron and Ottomans in silk, by the British Empire at its apex, and by nationalist movements at their most desperate. She could not have known that 3 of the world's great religions would trace their deepest roots to the hills she could see from where she knelt. She could not have known that her quiet valley would one day generate more pages of diplomatic correspondence, more resolutions of the United Nations, more newspaper headlines and protest signs and funeral processions than perhaps any comparably sized territory in human history. She knew the soil. She knew the river. She knew the seasons. That was enough. This is the story of that land. All of it. From the first seeds to the present hour. It is not a short story. It is not a simple one. It is a story in which nearly every sentence could be challenged, nearly every claim could be met with a counterclaim, and nearly every act of creation sits beside an act of destruction so tightly that separating them becomes impossible without distortion. We will try to tell it honestly. We will try to tell it gently. And we will try to tell it in a way that lets you rest, because the land itself, for all its turmoil, is also a place of extraordinary beauty, and because the people who have lived on it across 100 centuries have spent most of their time not at war but doing what people everywhere do, raising children, baking bread, watching the light change on stone walls, falling asleep to the sound of wind through olive trees. Settle in. Let the centuries come slowly. There is no hurry. Nuppers. On sources and silence before we begin, a word about how we know what we know and how much we do not. For the earliest periods, roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, we have no written sources at all. What we have is the work of archaeologists, the patient excavation of foundations, hearths, storage jars, human bones, animal bones, pollen samples, carbonized seeds. Sites like Jericho, like Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan, like Nahal Hamer in the Judean desert, have yielded evidence that is rich but mute. We can reconstruct what people ate, how they built, where they buried their dead, and sometimes how they decorated their skulls. Literally in the case of the famous plastered skulls of pre-pottery Jericho, where the living smoothed gypsum over the faces of the dead and set cowrie shells in the eye sockets, producing portraits of an eerie, intimate tenderness. But we cannot reconstruct what they believed, what they called themselves, or what they thought the land meant. For the Bronze Age, roughly 3,500 to 1200 BCE, we gain texts, but they are almost entirely external. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt, give us a window into the petty politics of Canaanite city-states in the 14th century BCE. local kings writing to Pharaoh in fractured Akkadian, begging for troops, accusing their neighbors of treachery, and painting a picture of a region under loose Egyptian control. The Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the prophets, the writings, provides a rich and detailed narrative of the Israelite experience, but it was composed, edited, and redacted over many centuries, and its relationship to recoverable historical events is a matter of intense and unresolved scholarly debate. Some of its accounts are corroborated by archaeology. Others are contradicted by it. Many exist in a space where the evidence is simply insufficient to confirm or deny. For the classical period, Persian, Greek, Roman, we have more. Herodotus, Josephus, Pliny, the Gospels, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Roman administrative records, and a wealth of coins, inscriptions, and architectural remains. For the Islamic period, the Arab geographers and historians, Al-Tabari, Al-Muqaddasi, Yaqut, provide detailed accounts, though always from particular perspectives. For the Ottoman centuries, administrative records in Istanbul offer tax rolls, census data, and court decisions that allow a remarkably granular picture of daily life. And for the modern period, from the late 19th century onward, we are overwhelmed. Memoirs, diplomatic cables, newspaper reports, photographs, film footage, oral histories, and the vast apparatus of modern record keeping. The problem for the modern period is not insufficient evidence, but superabundant evidence, filtered through competing national narratives that select, emphasize, and omit in ways that can make the same set of events look like two entirely different stories depending on who is telling them. We will draw on all of these. Where the evidence is strong, we will state things plainly. Where it is ambiguous, we will say so. Where it is absent, we will try to respect the silence rather than fill it with invention. The land has been spoken for by many. It has rarely been allowed to speak for itself. Let us begin. The oldest places. Imagine the Jordan Valley as it might have appeared 12,000 years ago at the tail end of the last ice age. The world was warming. Glaciers that had locked up vast quantities of water were releasing it. Sea levels were rising. Rainfall was increasing across the Levant, that crescent of land arching from modern Egypt through Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and down into Iraq. And the landscape was responding. The valley floor, cut deep between limestone ridges, carried the Jordan River south from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea, which sat then as now at the lowest point on the Earth's surface, more than 400 meters below sea level. The water was warm and mineral-laden. The air in the valley was thick, subtropical. Date palms grew along the riverbanks. Gazelle moved in herds across the steppe. And beside a spring near the western edge of the valley, at the base of a mound that would accumulate layer upon layer of human habitation until it rose like a tell, a flat-topped hill made entirely of compressed centuries, a community of perhaps 200 people was doing something that had almost never been done before in human history. They were staying. The site is Jericho. Site is. And to call it one of the oldest cities on earth is not metaphor or exaggeration. It is a plain archaeological statement. The lowest levels of Tel es-Sultan, the mound that marks ancient Jericho, contain the remains of structures dating to approximately 9,000 BCE. That is 11,000 years ago. That is older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. That is older than the Great Pyramid by more than 4,000 years. That is so old that when the Egyptians built the pyramids, Jericho was already more ancient to them than the pyramids are to us. The people of this earliest Jericho were not yet farmers in the full sense. They were Natufian or post-Natufian hunter-gatherers who had begun to settle in one place, drawn by the perennial spring, Ain es-Sultan, that produced a reliable flow of fresh water even in the driest months. They harvested wild grains. They hunted gazelle. They stored food in quantities that suggest they had decided the moving life was over. And then over the next millennium, slowly, unevenly, with failures we cannot see, they began to cultivate. Emmer wheat, barley, lentils. They penned goats. The village grew. The structures became more permanent. Round houses at first, with stone foundations and walls of shaped mud brick, then rectangular ones, then larger compounds, and at some point in the 9th millennium BCE, the people of Jericho did something that still puzzles archaeologists. They built a wall, not a thin fence, a stone wall, roughly 3.6 meters high and 1.8 meters thick, with a circular stone tower behind it rising nearly 9 meters, taller than a two-story building. This is the oldest known monumental architecture in the world. It predates the walls of Uruk in Mesopotamia by more than 4,000 years. The question is why? The traditional interpretation was defensive, a fortification against raiders or rival settlements. But more recent scholarship has suggested other possibilities. The wall may have been built to protect against mud flows from the hillside above. The tower may have served a ritual purpose. Excavations revealed human burials beneath it. Some archaeologists have proposed that the wall and tower were primarily about identity, a way for a community to mark itself as permanent, to say to the landscape, "We are here. We intend to remain. We are capable of organizing labor on a scale that no wandering band could match." We do not know which interpretation is correct. Perhaps all of them contain some truth. What we know is that by 9,000 years ago, on this small strip of land between the river and the sea, people had already begun the project that would define the place for the next 11 millennia. The project of building, defending, destroying, and rebuilding on the same contested ground. Das ist the Neolithic quiet. For the next several thousand years, roughly 8,000 to 4,000 BCE, the land filled slowly with farming villages. This is the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, and it is simultaneously the longest and the least dramatic chapter of the story. No kings, no armies, no inscriptions, no borders, just the slow accumulation of human presence on a landscape that rewarded settlement. The villages were small, rarely more than a few hundred people. They clustered where water was reliable, along the coastal plain where winter rains were generous, in the valleys and basins of the Central Highlands, along the Jordan Valley, and in the northern reaches near what would become the Sea of Galilee. The architecture was mud brick and stone. The economy was grain, olive, and goat. The dead were buried beneath house floors, sometimes with their skulls removed and plastered. That haunting Jericho practice, which spread across the region and suggests a cult of ancestor veneration whose details are entirely lost to us. The rhythm of life was seasonal. Plant in autumn after the first rains. Tend through winter. Harvest in spring. Store through the long, dry summer. Press olives in autumn. Begin again. This cycle, the cycle of the Mediterranean agricultural year Bimor, would persist essentially unchanged for 8,000 years, surviving the rise and fall of every empire that ever claimed the land. It is the deepest rhythm of Palestine, older than any politics, any religion, any national identity. It is the rhythm of wheat and olive and rain. Sometime around 4,500 BCE, a new technology arrived, copper smelting. The Chalcolithic period, the Copper Stone Age, marks a transitional era in which villages grew slightly larger, craftsmanship grew more sophisticated, and the first hints of social hierarchy appeared. At a site called Tel Eilat El Ghassul, near the Dead Sea, archaeologists found large multi-room houses with walls painted in elaborate geometric designs, stars, masks, what appears to be a procession of figures. At a cave in the Judean desert called Nahal Mishmar, a remarkable hoard of more than 400 copper objects was discovered, wrapped in a reed mat and hidden in a crevice. Mace heads, scepters, crowns, all elaborately cast. They are beautiful. They are clearly ceremonial. And they suggest that someone somewhere in this landscape had accumulated enough authority to commission prestige goods on a significant scale. But the Chalcolithic settlements disappeared around 3,500 BCE, and the reason is unclear. Climate change, perhaps, or a drying trend that made marginal lands uninhabitable, or internal social collapse, or simply the slow migration of population toward more favorable zones. The archaeological record shows abandonment, silence, and then, after a gap, the emergence of something new. The Bronze Age had begun. Canaan. The word Canaan is old. It appears in texts from Ebla in Syria dating to the 3rd millennium BCE, and in Egyptian documents from the 2nd millennium. Its exact etymology is debated. It may derive from a word meaning purple or red, possibly referring to the famous purple dye extracted from murex snails along the Levantine coast, the same dye that would later give the Phoenicians their Greek name. Whatever its origin, by the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, Canaan was the standard external label for the region between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, and Canaanites was the name given to its inhabitants. Who were the Canaanites? The honest answer is that they were not a single people with a unified identity. They were the inhabitants of a collection of independent city-states, small walled urban centers, each controlling the agricultural hinterland around it, that shared a broadly common language, a Northwest Semitic tongue ancestral to both Hebrew and Phoenician, a broadly common material culture, and a broadly common set of religious practices centered on gods whose names would echo for millennia: El, Baal, Asherah, Astarte. The major Canaanite cities read like a roll call of places that would remain significant for thousands of years. Megiddo, perched on a ridge overlooking the Jezreel Valley, the strategic pass connecting the coastal highway to the interior, so frequently fought over that its name, Armageddon, would become synonymous with the final battle of all time. Hazor, in the north, the largest Canaanite city, sprawling across nearly 200 acres. Gaza, on the southern coast, already an important trading hub. Jaffa, on the central coast. Shechem, in the central highlands. Lachish, in the Shephelah foothills. And Jerusalem, small at this point, a hill town controlling a spring, mentioned in Egyptian execration texts as early as the 19th century BCE, but not yet the city that 3 faiths would claim as sacred. These were not isolated villages. They were nodes in an international trading network that connected Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Canaanite merchants exported olive oil, wine, timber, and the famous purple dye. They imported copper, tin, luxury goods, and ideas. The pottery of a Canaanite household might sit beside an Egyptian scarab, a Mesopotamian cylinder seal, and a Cypriot perfume flask. The land was small, but it was not provincial. It was a crossroads. And because it was a crossroads, it was subject to the attention of every great power within reach. Egypt, in particular, regarded Canaan as its northern buffer zone, its sphere of influence, its first line of defense against the empires of the north and east. During the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egyptian control was direct and often heavy. Pharaoh Thutmose III fought the famous Battle of Megiddo around 1457 BCE, defeating a coalition of Canaanite rulers and establishing Egyptian garrisons throughout the region. The Amarna letters, written roughly a century later, show local Canaanite kings addressing Pharaoh Akhenaten as their lord, begging for military support against rivals and against a mysterious group called the Habiru, a term that has been debated endlessly and may or may not have any connection to the word Hebrew. The picture that emerges from the Amarna correspondence is of a land fragmented, fractious, and perpetually caught between larger forces. The local rulers had limited power. The real decisions were made in Thebes, or in Hattusa, the Hittite capital in central Anatolia, or in Ashur on the Tigris. Palestine, for the first but certainly not the last time, was a territory whose fate was determined by distant capitals. This is one of the deep structural facts of the place, and it will recur across every period we examine. The land is too small to be a great power. It is too strategically located to be left alone. It sits at the hinge point where Africa meets Asia, where the Mediterranean meets the desert, where north-south trade routes cross east-west ones. Every empire that aspires to regional dominance must either control this strip of land or neutralize it. And the people who live on it must constantly negotiate, resist, accommodate, or flee the ambitions of others. The Canaanites knew this. They had known it for centuries by the time the Bronze Age reached its zenith around 1300 BCE. Their cities were walled because walls were necessary. Their diplomacy was elaborate because survival required it. Their religion was eclectic because isolation was impossible. They had built on this small and coveted ground a civilization of considerable sophistication. Their scribes wrote in multiple languages. Their craftsmen produced works of fine detail. Their merchants operated across the known world. And then, in the space of a few decades around 1200 BCE, nearly everything collapsed. The catastrophe, the Bronze Age. Collapse is one of the great mysteries of ancient history. In the span of roughly 50 years, from approximately 1200 to 1150 BCE, the interconnected civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean came apart. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia disintegrated. The Mycenaean palace civilization in Greece fell. Egypt survived but was permanently weakened. Cities across the Levant were destroyed, some by fire, some by earthquake, some by causes that remain unclear. Trade networks that had linked the entire region fractured. Writing in some areas ceased entirely. The causes are debated and likely multiple: drought, famine, earthquakes, disruptions to the tin trade that made bronze possible, internal social revolt, and, most visibly, the arrival of groups the Egyptian sources called the Sea Peoples, raiders of uncertain origin who swept across the eastern Mediterranean in waves, attacking Egypt, ravaging the Levantine coast, and settling in the ruins of what they had destroyed. In Palestine, the collapse brought two new populations into the foreground, both of whom would define the next chapter of the land's history. Along the southern coast, in the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, a group the Egyptians called the Palisets settled and established themselves. They are the Philistines, and they almost certainly came from the Aegean world. Their early pottery is strikingly similar to Mycenaean styles, and their material culture shows distinctly non-Semitic features that gradually blended with local Canaanite traditions over the following centuries. They gave the land a name. The word Palestine derives from Philistia, transmitted through Greek as Palestine, and through Latin as Palestina. The name outlasted the people by 3,000 years. In the Central Highlands, the Dai, the rocky terraced hill country running like a spine through the interior, a different population was coalescing. These were the early Israelites, and the question of where they came from is one of the most contested in all of biblical archaeology. The traditional narrative, drawn from the Hebrew Bible, describes an exodus from Egypt, a divine covenant at Sinai, a 40-year wandering in the desert, and a military conquest of Canaan under Joshua. The archaeological evidence for this narrative is, to put it carefully, limited. There is no Egyptian record of the Exodus. There is no evidence of a large population wandering in Sinai. The conquest model, a swift military takeover of Canaanite cities, is contradicted by the evidence at several key sites. Jericho, whose walls famously fell in the biblical account, shows no significant occupation at the traditionally proposed date. What the archaeology does show is something arguably more interesting than conquest: a gradual emergence. In the highlands of the central region, beginning around 1200 BCE, hundreds of small, unwalled farming villages appeared in areas that had been sparsely settled during the late Bronze Age. The material culture of these villages is simple. No luxury imports, no monumental architecture, limited pottery, and it is broadly continuous with late Canaanite traditions, but with distinctive features, including an absence of pig bones, which may reflect an early dietary prohibition. The most widely accepted current model associated with archaeologist Israel Finkelstein and others suggests that the early Israelites were largely indigenous to the region. Canaanites who migrated to the highlands, perhaps joined by smaller groups from elsewhere, who gradually developed a distinct ethnic and religious identity over the course of several centuries. This does not mean the biblical narrative is pure invention. It means that the relationship between text and ground is more complicated than a simple read of either would suggest. We cannot resolve this debate here, and we should not pretend to. What matters for our story is the outcome. By the 11th century BCE, two new political realities existed in the land. The Philistines controlled the wealthy coastal plain. The Israelite tribes held the poorer but defensible highlands. Between them lay a tension that would produce one of the most consequential chapters in the region's long history. And between them, in the valleys and the foothills and the northern reaches, the Canaanite population continued, diminished, fragmented, absorbed, but not gone. They are the silent third party in the biblical narrative, the people who were already there, whose cities were already old when the new names arrived. They left no national epic. They left no book that survived into a world religion. The stories told about this period would be told by others, by the Israelites who remembered it as a divine promise fulfilled, by the Philistines who left only what the ground preserved, by the Egyptians who mentioned both in passing on their way to larger concerns. The Canaanites became, in the biblical text, the people to be displaced. In the archaeological record, they are the people who became everyone else, whose language evolved into Hebrew and Phoenician, whose gods were absorbed or rejected, whose blood and culture persisted in the very populations that claimed to have replaced them. This is the first great silence in the history of Palestine, and it will not be the last. The night is long. The land is patient. We have barely begun. Somewhere in the highlands, around the year 1000 BCE, a collection of tribes that shared a language, a set of stories, and an increasingly distinct sense of identity was about to attempt something that small peoples rarely achieve and almost never sustain. They were about to build a kingdom. But that belongs to the next movement of this story. For now, let the image settle. A chain of small stone villages clinging to limestone ridges, terraced fields dropping away into valleys where wild thyme grows between the rocks, a sky turning violet at dusk, the sound of sheep bells carrying across the still air. The land has been inhabited for 8,000 years by this point. It has been farmed, built upon, abandoned, rebuilt. It has been called Canaan by outsiders and nothing recoverable by its earliest people. It has been crossed by armies and caravans. It has been coveted by Egypt, courted by Mesopotamia, settled by people from across the sea, and it is just beginning. The olive trees are young, the stones are warm. The river runs south toward the lowest place on earth, as it always has, as it does tonight. Rest here a moment. The kingdoms are coming. Part 2, Kingdoms and Ashes. The story of the first Israelite kingdom begins, as so many stories in this land do, with a problem of scale. By the 11th century BCE, the Israelite tribes of the Central Highlands faced a military reality they could not solve with their existing social structure. The Philistines, settled on the coastal plain with their 5 great cities, were organized, well-armed, and expansionist. They had iron, a metal the Highland Israelites largely lacked, and they had the political coherence of an urban confederacy. The Israelites, by contrast, were a loose assembly of clans and tribes, led in times of crisis by ad hoc military leaders the biblical text calls judges. There was no standing army. There was no central treasury. There was no capital. The book of Samuel tells the story of what happened next in terms that are both political and theological. The people demanded a king. The prophet Samuel warned them that a king would take their sons for his armies, their daughters for his kitchens, their fields for his courtiers, and their freedom for his glory. They demanded a king anyway. The first was Saul, tall, from the tribe of Benjamin, chosen, according to the text, by divine lot. His reign was troubled, his wars against the Philistines were inconclusive, and his end was violent. He died on Mount Gilboa in the Jezreel Valley, falling on his own sword after a catastrophic defeat. The Philistines hung his body on the walls of Beth-shan. His successor was David. No figure in the history of this land casts a longer shadow. David is, in the biblical narrative, the shepherd boy who killed Goliath, the fugitive who hid in the caves of the Judean desert, the warlord who served as a mercenary for the Philistines before turning against them, the king who united the tribes, conquered Jerusalem, and established a dynasty that the text promises would endure forever. He is the author of Psalms, the dancer before the ark, the lover of Bathsheba, the father who wept for Absalom. He is flawed, brilliant, ruthless, devout, and utterly central to the self-understanding of three religions. The historical David is harder to find. Outside the Bible, the evidence for David is thin but not absent. A single inscription, the Tel Dan Stele, discovered in 1993 in northern Israel, contains a reference to the House of David, dated to roughly the 9th century BCE. This is the only near-contemporary extra-biblical mention of David, and its discovery was a genuine archaeological event. It confirmed that a dynasty associated with the name David existed and was known to its neighbors. It did not confirm the details of his biography. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. Sometime around 1000 BCE, a political entity centered in Jerusalem consolidated control over the Central Highlands and possibly beyond. Whether it was as grand as the biblical narrative suggests, an empire stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt, is doubtful. The archaeological evidence for 10th century Jerusalem shows a settlement that was, by the standards of contemporary Near Eastern capitals, modest. There are no palaces on the Mesopotamian scale, no monumental inscriptions, no administrative archives. The minimalist school of archaeology associated with Israel Finkelstein and others argues that the united monarchy of David and Solomon was a small highland chieftaincy that was later magnified by scribes writing centuries after the fact, projecting the grandeur of later periods back onto a simpler past. The maximalist school argues that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that Jerusalem's continuous habitation has destroyed much of the early record, and that the biblical account preserves a core of historical memory. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the contested middle. But the debate itself matters because the question of what David's kingdom actually was, how large, how powerful, how organized, is not merely academic. It is a question that reverberates in the present, invoked by those who see in the ancient kingdom a precedent for modern claims. We will not resolve it. We will note it and move on, carrying the uncertainty with us as the honest historian must. Solomon and the house on the hill. David's son Solomon is remembered for two things: wisdom and building. The biblical text describes a reign of extraordinary prosperity: gold from Ophir, cedars from Lebanon, a fleet of trading ships, diplomatic marriages with foreign princesses, and above all, the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. The temple. It is impossible to overstate what this building meant, both in its own time and across the millennia that followed. Described in lavish detail in the Book of Kings, its dimensions, its cedar paneling, its golden cherubim, its holy of holies where the Ark of the Covenant rested in darkness. The temple became the center of Israelite religious life, the place where heaven and earth were said to touch, the axis around which an entire civilization organized itself. No trace of Solomon's temple has been found. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the platform where it stood, where the Second Temple would later stand, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stand today, is the most archaeologically sensitive site on earth. Excavation is impossible for political and religious reasons. What lies beneath the platform remains unknown and, for the foreseeable future, unknowable. This is one of the most consequential silences in the history of the land. The building that 3,000 years of tradition place at the center of the story has left no physical trace that can be independently verified. It exists in text, in memory, in faith, and in the political imagination of the present. Whether it existed in stone and cedar in the manner the Bible describes is a question the ground has not answered and may never answer. What the archaeology of the broader region does show is that the 10th century BCE was a period of modest development in the highlands. Not the golden age of Solomonic legend, but not nothing either. Small fortified structures, some administrative activity, a gradual increase in settlement density. The picture is of a polity that was real, but perhaps not yet the kingdom that later memory made it. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split. The northern tribes, wealthier and more populous, broke away to form the kingdom of Israel with its capital eventually at Samaria. The southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remained loyal to David's line and formed the kingdom of Judah, with its capital at Jerusalem. Two kingdoms, one land, a fracture that would never fully heal. The divided centuries. The period of the divided monarchy, roughly 930 to 720 BCE for the northern kingdom and 930 to 586 BCE for the southern, is where the historical record begins to thicken. We have the biblical accounts in Kings and Chronicles. We have Assyrian and Babylonian inscriptions that mention Israelite and Judahite kings by name. We have archaeological remains of palaces, fortifications, seals, pottery that allow at least partial reconstruction of daily life. The northern kingdom of Israel was the larger, richer, and more cosmopolitan of the two. Its capital, Samaria, was an impressive hilltop city with fine ashlar masonry and ivory-decorated furniture. The Omride dynasty, King Omri and his son Ahab, who ruled in the 9th century BCE, appear in Assyrian records as significant regional players. Ahab contributed 2,000 chariots to a coalition that fought the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. The biblical text, however, remembers the Omrides primarily for their religious sins, their tolerance of Baal worship, their conflict with the prophet Elijah, the infamous Jezebel. This tension between the archaeological record and the biblical narrative runs through the entire period. The biblical writers were not historians in the modern sense. They were theologians, interpreting events through a framework of divine covenant. When the people obeyed God, they prospered. When they strayed, they suffered. The military and economic history of the kingdoms was subordinated to this theological logic, which means that prosperous kings who tolerated foreign worship could be condemned, while poorer kings who enforced orthodoxy could be praised. We need both records. We need the Assyrian annals that tell us how many chariots Ahab fielded, and we need the biblical text that tells us what the prophets thought it meant. Neither alone is sufficient. The southern kingdom of Judah was smaller, poorer, more isolated, and more religiously conservative. Jerusalem remained its capital, the temple, its central institution. The Davidic dynasty held the throne continuously, a remarkable feat of dynastic endurance in a region where coups and usurpations were common. Judah survived partly because it was less strategically important than the north, partly because its terrain was more defensible, and partly because its rulers generally had the sense to submit to whatever great power was currently dominant rather than resist and be destroyed. The north was not so lucky. The Assyrian shadow Assyria, based in what is now northern Iraq, was the great predator of the age. By the 8th century BCE, it had developed the most efficient military machine the ancient world had yet seen. Iron weapons, siege engines, cavalry, and a policy of deliberate terror, mass deportation, public impalement, the flaying of captured kings, designed to discourage resistance before it began. The Kingdom of Israel spent its last decades trapped between the desire for independence and the impossibility of defying Assyrian power. King after king miscalculated. Alliances with Egypt and Damascus promised relief, but delivered nothing. In 722 BCE, after a 3-year siege, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, or possibly his successor Sargon II, captured Samaria and destroyed the northern kingdom entirely. The Assyrian records state that 27,290 people were deported from Samaria and resettled in Mesopotamia and Media. Foreign populations were brought in to replace them. The kingdom of Israel, which had existed for roughly 2 centuries, was erased as a political entity. Its 10 tribes were scattered into the Assyrian Empire and gradually lost their distinct identity. The famous lost tribes of Israel Durur, who have generated legend and speculation ever since, but who almost certainly assimilated into the populations among whom they were settled, as displaced peoples usually do. The people who remained in the northern territory, Rinur, a mixture of Israelites who had not been deported and the foreign settlers brought in by Assyria, became the Samaritans, a community that practiced a form of Israelite religion centered on Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem. The Samaritans were despised by the Judahites as impure, half-foreign, heretical. The enmity between Judah and Samaria, between Jerusalem and Gerizim, would persist for centuries and leave its trace in the New Testament's parable of the Good Samaritan, whose moral force depends on the audience knowing that Samaritans were precisely the people a Judean audience would least expect to show compassion. A small Samaritan community survives to this day, Shais. Roughly 800 people, living near Nablus and in Holon, still performing animal sacrifice on Mount Gerizim at Passover, still reading their own version of the Torah in an ancient script. They are among the oldest continuously surviving religious communities on earth. And they are a living reminder that the history of this land has never been binary. It has never been simply one people against another. There have always been third parties, minority communities, people who fit no one's narrative neatly, who persist in the margins of stories told by others. Jerusalem alone. After 722 BCE, the kingdom of Judah stood alone. The north was gone, Assyria was supreme, and Judah survived by doing what small states wedged between empires have always done. It paid tribute, kept its head down, and prayed. The late 8th century BCE was, paradoxically, a period of growth for Jerusalem. Refugees from the destroyed northern kingdom flooded south, swelling the city's population. Archaeological evidence shows that Jerusalem expanded dramatically during this period. The city spread west onto a new hill, new walls were built, new water systems were engineered. The famous Siloam Tunnel, a remarkable feat of ancient engineering that channeled water from the Gihon Spring to a pool inside the city walls, dates to this era. An inscription found inside the tunnel, written in classical Hebrew, describes the moment when the 2 teams of diggers cutting from opposite ends broke through and met in the middle. It is one of the oldest known Hebrew inscriptions, and it records not a king or a god, but a moment of human labor. The sound of picks in stone, the rush of water, the shouts of men who had spent months cutting blind through rock. This period also saw the emergence of the great literary prophets, Isaiah, Micah, and later Jeremiah, whose writings would become foundational texts of Western moral thought. Their message was radical and uncomfortable, that God cared less about temple sacrifice than about justice, that the powerful would be held to account for their treatment of the poor, that national security depended not on military alliances, but on moral conduct. What does the Lord require of you, Micah asked, but to do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. These were not popular sentiments. The prophets were, by their own accounts, rejected, mocked, imprisoned. But their words were preserved, written down, copied, transmitted, and they would outlast every army, every empire, every city wall that their contemporaries considered more important. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib invaded Judah, destroyed 46 towns and villages, and besieged Jerusalem itself. The Assyrian relief panels from Nineveh, now in the British Museum, depict the siege of Lachish, Judah's second city, in brutal detail. Battering rams against the walls, defenders hurling torches and stones, captives being led away, impaled bodies decorating the approach road. It is one of the most vivid military narratives to survive from the ancient world, and it shows what Assyrian power meant in practice. Jerusalem, however, survived. The biblical account credits divine intervention. An angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. The Assyrian records, unsurprisingly, tell a different story. Hezekiah paid an enormous tribute, and Sennacherib, satisfied, withdrew. Herodotus, writing centuries later, offers a third version involving a plague of mice that devoured the Assyrians' bowstrings. Modern historians generally favor a combination of tribute, plague, and pressing military concerns elsewhere in the empire. Whatever the cause, Jerusalem stood. And the mere fact of its survival became a theological datum of enormous power. The city was not simply a political capital. It was, in the developing theology of Judah, the place God had chosen, inviolable, sacred, eternal. This belief would be tested, catastrophically, within a century. The destruction of Assyria fell. Empires do. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sacked Nineveh, and the greatest military power the ancient Near East had known collapsed with a speed that shocked the world. The prophet Nahum celebrated the destruction in verses of savage beauty. Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? But the vacuum Assyria left was filled not by freedom, but by a new empire. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar II, inherited Assyria's ambitions and much of its territory, and Judah, trapped in the same geographic vice that had always defined its existence, found itself once again choosing between submission and resistance. King Josiah, who had used the period of Assyrian decline to launch a religious reform of remarkable ambition, it seems, centralizing worship in Jerusalem, purging foreign cults, and reportedly discovering a lost book of the law in the temple that most scholars identify as an early form of Deuteronomy, died at Megiddo in 609 BCE, killed trying to block an Egyptian army marching north. His successors vacillated between Egyptian and Babylonian allegiance. In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, captured the young king Jehoiakim, and deported him along with thousands of the city's elite to Babylon. A puppet king, Zedekiah, was installed. He rebelled. It was the last rebellion Jerusalem would make for centuries. In 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned. The siege lasted 18 months. When the walls were finally breached, Zedekiah fled toward the Jordan Valley and was captured near Jericho. His sons were executed before his eyes. Then his eyes were put out, and he was led in chains to Babylon. The city was destroyed, the temple was burned, the walls were torn down. The remaining population, or a significant portion of it, was deported to Babylon. This is the event that the Jewish tradition remembers as the Churban, the destruction. It is commemorated annually on Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning that would later also mark the destruction of the Second Temple by Rome in 70 CE. The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, captures the anguish in language that still has the power to stun. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become, she who was great among the nations. The destruction of 586 BCE was not merely a military defeat. It was a theological crisis. The temple, the dwelling place of God, was gone. The Davidic dynasty, promised eternal rule, was in chains. The land, given by covenant, was lost. Every assumption on which Judahite religion had been built was, in a single catastrophic year, overturned. What happened next is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human thought. In exile in Babylon, the scribes and priests of Judah did not abandon their faith. They reimagined it, they wrote, they edited, they compiled. Much of what we now know as the Hebrew Bible, the Re'fer, the Torah, the historical books, the prophetic literature, reached something close to its final form during the exile, or in the period immediately following. The religion that had depended on a temple, a king, and a land was reconstructed as a religion that could survive without any of them. Portable, textual, built not on stone, but on story. This is the birth of Judaism as we know it. Not the religion of the First Temple, with its animal sacrifice and its priestly aristocracy, but the religion of the book, the religion that could be carried into any exile, practiced in any land, transmitted through any catastrophe. The land, meanwhile, was not empty. This is a point that requires emphasis because it is frequently overlooked. The Babylonians deported the urban elite, Priests, scribes, craftsmen, royal officials, the rural population, the farmers and herders who worked the soil, largely remained. The prophet Jeremiah, who had stayed behind, describes a land diminished but not abandoned. Archaeological evidence confirms continuity of settlement in many areas, particularly in the region north of Jerusalem. The exiles in Babylon remembered the land with a longing that became constitutive of their identity. By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down, and there we wept, when we remembered Zion. This psalm, Psalm 137, is perhaps the most famous expression of exile in world literature. It ends with a verse of disturbing violence, blessing on whoever dashes Babylon's children against the stones, that is often omitted from liturgical readings, but that captures something raw and true about the psychology of displacement. The way grief curdles into rage, the way loss generates fantasies of retribution. The exile lasted roughly 50 years. Return and reconstruction. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. His policy towards subject peoples was markedly different from the Assyrian and Babylonian approach. Rather than deportation and forced assimilation, Cyrus permitted, if even encouraged, displaced populations to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document found in Babylon, describes this policy in terms of religious tolerance, though the motive was likely as much strategic as magnanimous. Content subjects are cheaper to govern than resentful ones. The Jews, we can begin to use that term now, derived from Judah, the kingdom from which most of the exiles came, were among those permitted to return. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe the process, a series of returns over several decades. The rebuilding of the temple, completed around 516 BCE, the second temple more modest than the first, and the reconstruction of Jerusalem's walls under Nehemiah's leadership around 445 BCE. But the return was not simple, and it was not complete. Many Jews remained in Babylon, where they had built lives, businesses, and communities. The Babylonian Jewish community would persist for over 2,000 years, producing the Babylonian Talmud, the more authoritative of the two Talmuds, and maintaining an unbroken presence until the mass emigration of the 20th century. Exile, it turned out, was not merely a punishment to be endured and escaped. It was a condition that could become permanent, generative, even central to identity. And those who did return found that the land had not waited for them. The people who had remained Sexribis, the rural poor, the Samaritans, the mixed populations of the north, had their own claims, their own practices, their own relationship to the soil. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe bitter conflicts between the returning exiles and the local population, particularly over intermarriage. Ezra, in a passage that still troubles modern readers, demanded that Jewish men divorce their foreign wives and send away their children. The community was to be purified. The boundaries were to be drawn sharp. Here, in the 5th century BCE, we see a pattern that will repeat. The returning exile who finds the homeland changed, the tension between those who left and those who stayed, the insistence on purity of identity as a response to the experience of dispersion. It is a pattern that will echo across millennia, through the Roman diaspora, through the medieval centuries, through the modern Zionist movement. The relationship between the land and the people who claim it from a distance is never simple, and those who remained on it rarely welcome the returnees without friction. Under Persian rule, Judah, now called Yehud, the Aramaic form of the name, was a small, quiet province. It had no king. It was governed by a Persian-appointed governor, or sometimes by the high priest in Jerusalem, who became an increasingly powerful figure. The temple was the center of communal life. The Torah was codified and read publicly. The religion crystallized around text, law, and observance. The land was at peace. Not the peace of sovereignty, but the peace of submission. The peace of a small province in a vast empire that stretched from Egypt to India, that governed through satraps and tolerance and the efficient collection of taxes. For roughly 2 centuries, from 539 to 332 BCE, Palestine slipped out of the dramatic current of history. No great battles were fought there. No prophets thundered. The slow rhythms reasserted themselves. The planting, the harvest, the pressing of olives, the prayers in the rebuilt temple, the letters sent to relatives still in Babylon. It was in many ways a gentle time. The kind of time that history tends to skip over because nothing happened that generated texts of crisis or triumph. But people lived. They raised children in stone houses on terraced hillsides. They watched the same light fall on the same limestone that their ancestors had watched for 3,000 years. They told the old stories of Abraham and Moses, of David and Solomon, of the exile and the return, and in the telling they became who they were. The olive trees grew slowly in the rocky soil. They always do. An olive tree can live 1,000 years. Some of the trees still standing in the ancient groves of Palestine may have roots that reach back to this quiet century, this forgotten peace. But peace in this land has always been a pause between empires. And in 332 BCE, a young man from Macedonia rode into the Levant with 30,000 soldiers and the ambition to remake the world. His name was Alexander, and nothing would be quiet again for a long time. Rest here. Let the Persian centuries settle like dust on a stone floor. The Greek storm is coming, but it is not here yet. For now, the temple stands. The prayers are said. The farmers bring their first fruits to Jerusalem in spring, walking the ancient paths through the hills, and the city receives them as it has received them for generations. The land is small, the land is patient, the land abides. Part 3. Hellenism and Resistance. Alexander arrived in the Levant in 332 BCE, and the land barely had time to register his presence before he was gone. He swept south along the coast, accepted the submission of most cities without a fight, besieged Tyre for 7 months, and Gaza for 2, both with characteristic brutality, and then continued into Egypt, where he founded Alexandria, consulted an oracle, and declared himself a god, or at least did not discourage others from doing so. Palestine he passed through rather than conquered in any meaningful sense. Jerusalem, according to a story told by Josephus centuries later, opened its gates to him voluntarily, and the high priest met him in his vestments, and Alexander bowed before the name of God inscribed on the priestly diadem. The story is almost certainly legendary. What is more likely is that Jerusalem, having seen what happened to Tyre and Gaza, calculated the odds and submitted. It was the rational choice. It was the choice this city had been making for centuries. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, aged 32, and his empire immediately fractured. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, carved the conquered world into competing kingdoms and spent the next 40 years fighting over the pieces. Palestine, as always, found itself on the seam. To the south, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable generals, seized Egypt and founded a dynasty that would rule from Alexandria for nearly 3 centuries. To the north and east, Seleucus established a kingdom that eventually stretched from Anatolia to the borders of India, with its capital at Antioch in Syria. Between these two successor states, Palestine became what it had been under the Egyptians and Assyrians and Babylonians before them: a buffer, a prize, a territory whose ownership was determined by the relative strength of the powers on either side of it. The Ptolemies held it first. For roughly a century, from about 301 to 198 BCE, Palestine was a province of Ptolemaic Egypt, governed from Alexandria, taxed efficiently, and largely left alone in matters of religion and internal affairs. The Ptolemaic system was extractive, but not culturally aggressive. Jewish life in Jerusalem continued. The temple functioned. The high priest governed. Greek became the language of administration and commerce, but Aramaic remained the language of daily life, and Hebrew remained the language of scripture and prayer. It was during this period that something happened in Alexandria that would have consequences far beyond anything the Ptolemies intended. The Jewish community in Egypt, large, established, increasingly Greek-speaking, produced a translation of the Torah into Greek. This translation, which grew over time to encompass the entire Hebrew Bible, is known as the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, after the legend that 72 scholars produced identical translations independently, proving divine guidance. The Septuagint made the Jewish scriptures accessible to the entire Greek-speaking world. It planted ideas, monotheism, covenant, prophecy, messianic expectation in soil where they would eventually germinate into Christianity. It was, in a sense, the first great act of cultural translation in Western history, and it happened because a community of exiles in a foreign city needed to read their own sacred texts in the only language their children still understood. The loss of Hebrew among diaspora Jews was not a failure. It was an adaptation, and the adaptation produced a text that would reshape the world. The Seleucid Crisis. In 198 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemaic army at the Battle of Panium, near the headwaters of the Jordan River, and Palestine passed from Egyptian to Syrian control. The transition was initially smooth. Antiochus granted the Jews favorable terms: tax reductions, respect for the temple, prohibition of foreign presence in the sacred precincts. Jerusalem had simply exchanged one distant overlord for another, but the Seleucid kingdom was under pressure. Rome was rising in the west and had already humiliated Antiochus III, forcing him to pay an enormous indemnity and surrender territory in Anatolia. The Seleucids needed money, and they pursued it through a combination of taxation, temple plundering, and cultural policies that would provoke the most consequential uprising in the history of ancient Palestine. Antiochus IV, who took the throne in 175 BCE and adopted the title Epiphany, or God Manifest, was not simply a tyrant, though the Jewish sources remember him as one. He was a Hellenizing monarch who believed that cultural unity would strengthen his fractured kingdom. He promoted Greek institutions, the gymnasium, the theater, the philosophical school, not out of malice toward local traditions, but out of a genuine conviction that Greek civilization was superior and universal, that it could absorb and elevate the diverse peoples of his realm. Among some Jews, this was welcome. There was a significant faction in Jerusalem, primarily among the wealthy priestly aristocracy, that embraced Hellenization, that saw in Greek culture sophistication, opportunity, and the path to full participation in the wider Mediterranean world. They built a gymnasium in Jerusalem. They adopted Greek names. They wore Greek clothing. Some, according to the sources, underwent surgical procedures to reverse circumcision so they could exercise naked in the Greek fashion without marking themselves as different. This was not universal. For many Jews, particularly the rural poor and the religiously conservative, Hellenization was apostasy. The gymnasium was an abomination. The Greek names were a betrayal. The erosion of ancestral practice was not modernization, but extinction. The crisis came to a head in 167 BCE. Antiochus IV, possibly responding to a civil conflict in Jerusalem between pro- and anti-Hellenizing factions, and certainly motivated by the need for revenue, took a series of actions that the Jewish sources describe as unprecedented persecution. He looted the temple treasury. He banned circumcision, Sabbath observance, and the study of Torah under penalty of death. He erected an altar to Zeus in the temple, the abomination of desolation that the book of Daniel references, and sacrificed pigs on it. Whether Antiochus understood what he was provoking is unclear. He may have believed he was dealing with a minor provincial disturbance. He may have been advised by the Hellenizing Jewish faction that the traditionalists were a small minority who would quickly submit. If so, he was catastrophically wrong. The Maccabees. The revolt began in the village of Modian, in the foothills between the coastal plain and the highlands. A priest named Mattathias of the Hasmonean family refused to perform a pagan sacrifice when ordered to do so by a Seleucid official. When another Jew stepped forward to comply, Mattathias killed him. Then he killed the official. Then he fled to the hills with his 5 sons and called on all who were faithful to follow. It was a gesture of desperate fury. It should not have worked. Mattathias died within a year. Leadership passed to his third son Judah, who acquired the nickname Maccabee, probably meaning the hammer. Judah was a gifted guerrilla commander who understood the terrain and understood that a small force fighting in its own hills could neutralize the advantages of a larger, better equipped army operating in unfamiliar country. He ambushed Seleucid columns in narrow passes. He attacked at night. He avoided pitched battle when the odds were unfavorable and struck decisively when they were not. The Seleucid response was hampered by the same problem that would hamper every occupying power in this landscape for the next 2,000 years. They had other concerns. The Seleucid Empire was fighting on multiple fronts against Parthia in the east, against internal pretenders, against Roman diplomatic pressure. Palestine was important, but not central. The troops assigned to suppress the revolt were often second-rate, their commanders overconfident or under-resourced. In December 164 BCE, Judah Maccabee entered Jerusalem, purified the temple, and rededicated it. This is the event commemorated by the festival of Hanukkah, the rededication, which would become one of the most widely observed holidays in Jewish practice, though it is worth noting that its prominence in the modern world owes as much to its proximity to Christmas on the calendar as to its original theological significance. The war did not end with the rededication. It continued with shifting alliances and brutal setbacks for another 20 years. Judah himself died in battle in 160 BCE at Elasa, overwhelmed by a vastly superior Seleucid force. His brothers Jonathan and Simon continued the fight, exploiting Seleucid dynastic conflicts with remarkable diplomatic skill. Jonathan played rival claimants to the Seleucid throne against each other, extracting concessions from each. Simon, the last surviving brother, finally achieved what none of them had originally imagined possible: full political independence. In 142 BCE, Simon was recognized as high priest, military commander, and ruler of Judea. The Seleucid garrison was expelled from Jerusalem. Taxes to Antioch ceased. For the first time in over 400 years, since the Babylonian destruction of 586 BCE, the Jews governed themselves in their own land. The achievement was genuine. It was also more complicated than the Festival of Lights suggests. The Hasmonean Kingdom. The Hasmonean dynasty that Mattathias' family established would rule for roughly 80 years, from 142 to 63 BCE. It is a period that Jewish tradition has treated with considerable ambivalence, and the reasons are instructive. The Maccabees had begun as defenders of tradition against Hellenization. The Hasmonean kings who followed them became, in many respects, Hellenizers themselves. They adopted Greek names alongside their Hebrew ones. They minted coins with Greek inscriptions. They employed mercenaries. They conducted diplomacy in the idiom of Hellenistic statecraft. The family that had fought against the fusion of Jewish and Greek culture presided over precisely that fusion. More troubling to religious sensibilities was the Hasmonean combination of political and religious authority. The Hasmonean rulers served as both king and high priest, a concentration of power that had no precedent in Israelite tradition, and that violated the sensibilities of those who believed the two offices should be held separately. The Pharisees, an influential movement emphasizing oral law and popular piety, frequently clashed with the Hasmonean rulers. The Essenes, a more radical sect, withdrew from Jerusalem entirely, apparently viewing the Hasmonean priesthood as illegitimate. Some scholars believe the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran was an Essene group that had rejected the Hasmonean religious establishment. The Hasmonean kings also expanded the territory under their control through military conquest, and the methods they used raise questions that resist easy answers. John Hyrcanus, who ruled from 134 to 104 BCE, conquered the region of Idumea to the south and forced its population to convert to Judaism. This was forced conversion, an act that sits uncomfortably with both ancient and modern sensibilities, and one that would have ironic consequences. The Idumean converts included the family of Herod, who would later overthrow the Hasmoneans and rule Judea as a Roman client king. Aristobulus I conquered parts of the Galilee and apparently imposed Judaism on its population as well. His successor, Alexander Jannaeus, waged wars of expansion in every direction, against the Nabateans to the east, the coastal cities to the west, the territories to the north, and suppressed internal dissent with shocking violence. Josephus reports that Jannaeus, after defeating a Pharisaic revolt, crucified 800 of his opponents while feasting with his concubines and watching them die. The Hasmonean period forces a question that the clean narrative of Maccabean heroism tends to obscure. What happens when the oppressed gain power? The Maccabees fought for religious freedom. Their descendants imposed religious conformity by force. The dynasty born in resistance to empire became an empire in miniature, conquering neighbors, forcibly converting populations, and suppressing dissent with methods indistinguishable from those of the Seleucid kings they had overthrown. This is not a moral lesson to be extracted and applied neatly. It is a historical pattern, and it recurs in this land with a regularity that approaches the structural. Power, in this small and contested territory, tends to reproduce the behaviors of the power it replaced. The specifics change, the dynamic persists. Rome. The Hasmonean kingdom ended the way most small states between great powers end. It was swallowed. By the mid-1st century BCE, the Hasmonean dynasty had fractured into civil war. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, fought each other for the throne, each seeking allies among the neighboring powers. Both made the fatal error of appealing to Rome. Rome in the 1st century BCE was the most powerful entity on earth, and it was moving east. Pompey the Great, fresh from his conquest of the Seleucid remnant, arrived in the Levant in 63 BCE with the irresistible force of Roman legions and the pragmatic ruthlessness of Roman statecraft. Both Hasmonean brothers pleaded their case before him. A delegation of ordinary Jews also appeared, asking Pompey to abolish the monarchy entirely and restore the older system of priestly governance. Pompey listened to all three parties. Then he took Jerusalem by force. The siege lasted 3 months. The final assault came on a Sabbath. Josephus says the Romans had learned that the Jews would defend their walls on the Sabbath but would not launch offensive operations, so the legions built their siege ramps unmolested. When the walls were breached, the fighting was fierce. 12,000 Jews died, according to Josephus. Pompey entered the temple and walked into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum, where only the high priest was permitted to enter once a year, on the Day of Atonement. He looked around. It was empty. No idol, no image, no golden statue. Just a dark room, thick with the residue of incense and the weight of centuries of belief. The Roman general, accustomed to temples crowded with divine statues, found a space defined by absence. The God of the Jews could not be seen. This was, for a pagan observer, both baffling and faintly troubling. Pompey, to his credit, did not loot the temple. He restored Hyrcanus II as high priest, stripped of the royal title, and placed Judea under Roman oversight. Independence was over. It had lasted 80 years. The decades that followed were a slow tightening of Roman control. Julius Caesar replaced Pompey. Augustus replaced Caesar. Through it all, a family of Idumean origin, descendants of those forcibly converted by the Hasmoneans, maneuvered with extraordinary skill through Roman factional politics. The family's most famous member was Herod. Herod. The Great Herod is one of the most paradoxical figures in the history of this land, which is saying something for a territory that specializes in paradox. He was not ethnically Jewish by traditional reckoning. He was Idumean, a member of a people who had been forcibly converted barely a century earlier. He was not accepted as legitimate by much of the Jewish population, who regarded him as a foreign usurper imposed by Rome. He was paranoid, violent, and capable of acts of extraordinary cruelty. He executed his own wife Mariamne, several of his sons, and anyone he suspected of threatening his throne. He was also the greatest builder the land had ever seen. The Temple Mount, as it exists today for the vast platform in Jerusalem, its retaining walls of massive Herodian ashlar blocks still visible, still stunning in their precision, is Herod's work. He expanded the Temple Mount to roughly 36 acres, constructing an elevated plaza supported by enormous retaining walls, of which the western wall is the most famous surviving section. The temple itself he rebuilt on a grand scale, with white stone and gold ornamentation that, according to Josephus, was so brilliant in the morning sun that it forced observers to look away. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Talmud preserves a saying, "He who has not seen the temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building." He built the port city of Caesarea Maritima on the coast, a Roman city complete with hippodrome, amphitheater, aqueduct, and an artificial harbor constructed using underwater concrete, a technology the Romans had recently developed. He built the fortress of Masada on a remote plateau above the Dead Sea, with palaces, bathhouses, storerooms, and cisterns hewn into the rock. He built the Herodium, a palace fortress shaped like a truncated volcano visible from Jerusalem, which doubled as his eventual tomb. All of this was built with Jewish labor and Jewish taxes, for the greater glory of a king most Jews despised, in a style that was thoroughly Roman, using an architectural language that spoke of power, permanence, and submission to the imperial order. Herod's buildings were not expressions of Jewish identity. They were expressions of Herod's identity, a man who lived between worlds, who needed Rome to survive and needed Jewish legitimacy to govern, and who built monuments that tried to satisfy both masters and satisfied neither. He died in 4 BCE. Yes, before the traditional date of the birth of Jesus, which tells you something about the reliability of later chronological calculations. His kingdom was divided among 3 of his surviving sons, none of whom inherited his political talent. Within a generation, Rome had dispensed with the pretense of local rulers and imposed direct provincial governance. Judea became a Roman province governed by a prefect appointed from Rome, who reported to the governor of Syria. The most famous of these prefects held office from 26 to 36 CE. His name was Pontius Pilate, the carpenter's son. We must tread carefully here, not because the evidence is thin, though in some respects it is, but because the figure we are approaching has generated more passion, more devotion, more conflict, and more interpretation than any other human being who has walked this land. And this land has not lacked for consequential figures. Jesus of Nazareth was born probably around 4 to 6 BCE in the Galilee, the northern region that the Hasmoneans had brought under Jewish control only a century earlier. His world was one of small farming villages, Aramaic speech, Roman taxation, Jewish piety, and simmering political tension. The Galilee was poorer and less urbanized than Judea. It was distant from Jerusalem, from the temple establishment, from the centers of religious authority. It produced, in the Roman period, a disproportionate number of prophets, healers, revolutionaries, and troublemakers, categories that in first century Palestine overlapped considerably. What Jesus taught, what he intended, and what he believed about himself are questions that have consumed 2,000 years of theological argument and cannot be settled in a narration of Palestine's history. What we can say, staying close to the ground, is this: he attracted followers. He preached in terms that combined traditional Jewish prophetic language with a radical emphasis on divine immediacy. He made claims, or allowed claims to be made about him, that the temple authorities found threatening. And he was executed by the Roman prefect by crucifixion, the standard Roman punishment for sedition and banditry. Probably in the year 30 or 33 CE, his death, in the context of first century Palestine, was unremarkable. The Romans crucified thousands. Josephus describes mass crucifixions during the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE with the weary precision of a bureaucrat recording routine operations. A provincial holy man executed for disturbing the peace was, by the standards of Roman Palestine, barely worth noting. That this particular execution became the most consequential event in the history of Western civilization is something that no contemporary observer could have predicted. The movement Jesus left behind was tiny, disorganized, concentrated among the poor and marginal, and almost entirely contained within the Jewish community of Palestine. It would be decades before the followers of Jesus, not yet called Christians, began to spread significantly beyond the land where their teacher had lived and died. It would be centuries before the faith they carried became the official religion of the Roman Empire, but the seed was in the ground. And the soil of Palestine, as we have seen, is good at producing things that outlast every expectation. The Great Revolt. The decades after Jesus' death saw a steady escalation of tension between the Jewish population of Palestine and their Roman governors. The causes were structural, not incidental. Roman taxation was heavy and resented. Roman cultural insensitivity, the introduction of imperial images into Jerusalem, the appointment of high priests for political rather than religious reasons, the casual brutality of Roman soldiers toward a subject population they regarded with a mixture of contempt and bewilderment, produced a slow accumulation of grievance. Jewish society was itself deeply divided. The Sadducees, the priestly aristocracy, generally cooperated with Rome, seeing collaboration as the price of maintaining the temple and their own position. The Pharisees sought to preserve Jewish law and practice within the framework of Roman rule. The Essenes withdrew, and an increasingly radical faction, whom Josephus calls the Zealots, though the term covers several distinct groups, argued that no accommodation with Rome was acceptable, that God would intervene on behalf of those who fought, and that armed resistance was a religious duty. In 66 CE, the tension broke. A series of provocations on Rurens, the theft of silver from the temple by the Roman procurator Gessius Florus, the killing of Jewish protesters, the humiliation of Jewish delegates, triggered an armed uprising that rapidly spread across the country. Roman garrisons were overrun. The legate of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marched south with a legion and was defeated and driven back in a stunning upset at Beth Horon, losing the legion's eagle, one of the most humiliating events in recent Roman military history. The victory was intoxicating. It was also a death sentence. Rome did not lose wars against provincial rebels. It could not afford to. The empire's entire structure rested on the certainty that resistance would be crushed, that the cost of rebellion would be so catastrophic that no rational population would attempt it. A rebellion that succeeded even temporarily threatened the entire imperial order. The Emperor Nero dispatched Vespasian, one of Rome's most experienced generals, with 60,000 troops. Vespasian methodically reconquered the Galilee in 67 CE, taking town after town, massacring resistors, enslaving survivors. Josephus, who had commanded the Jewish forces in the Galilee before defecting to the Romans, describes the campaign in detail, including his own surrender, which he justified by claiming a prophetic revelation that Vespasian would become emperor. Vespasian, amused or pragmatic, spared him. In 68 CE, Nero died, and Rome plunged into civil war, 4 emperors in a single year. Vespasian, seeing his opportunity, left the Judean campaign to his son Titus and marched on Rome. Josephus's prophecy, whether genuine or retroactively convenient, proved correct. Vespasian became emperor. Titus returned to finish the job. In the spring of 70 CE, Roman legions encircled Jerusalem. Inside the city, the defenders were split into warring factions, zealots, Sicarii, followers of rival commanders, who fought each other even as the Romans closed in. The siege lasted 5 months. Josephus, watching from the Roman lines, describes the famine inside the walls in terms that haunt. Mothers eating their children, corpses piled in the streets, the living too weak to bury the dead. In August of 70 CE, the Romans breached the final defenses and entered the Temple Mount. The temple burned. Whether Titus ordered the destruction, or whether the fire was set by soldiers in the chaos of battle, is a question Josephus himself seems uncertain about. What is certain is that the building Herod had spent decades constructing, the building that had stood at the center of Jewish life for 500 years in its second incarnation, and for 1,000 years counting the first, or Rees, was reduced to rubble and ash in a single day. The Arch of Titus, which still stands in the Roman Forum, depicts the triumph that followed. Roman soldiers carrying the temple's golden menorah, its silver trumpets, and the table of showbread through the streets of Rome. The relief is a monument to victory. It is also inadvertently the most detailed surviving image of objects that were sacred to the people from whom they were stolen. Jews for centuries would not walk beneath that arch. The destruction of the Second Temple was, for Judaism, a catastrophe of the same magnitude as the first destruction in 586 BCE, and in some ways deeper, because this time there would be no return, no rebuilding, no restoration. The temple has never been rebuilt. The sacrificial system that was its purpose has never been resumed. The priesthood that served it has never been reconstituted. What survived was what the exiles in Babylon had begun to build 6 centuries earlier, a religion of text, of law, of interpretation, of community gathered around a book rather than a building. The rabbis, and the teachers of oral law, the heirs of the Pharisaic tradition, rebuilt Judaism from its ruins, producing over the next several centuries the Mishnah and the Talmud, the vast literary monuments of rabbinic thought that would guide Jewish life for the next 2 millennia. The land itself was devastated. Josephus claims that over 1 million people died during the siege and its aftermath, though this number is almost certainly exaggerated. Hundreds of thousands were sold into slavery. Jerusalem was left in ruins, its population killed or scattered. Jewish settlement continued in the Galilee and in scattered communities elsewhere, but the demographic and political center of Jewish life had been shattered. One last convulsion remained. In 132 CE, under the Emperor Hadrian, the Jews of Palestine rose again. The Bar Kokhba revolt, named for its leader Simon Bar Kokhba, whom the great Rabbi Akiva hailed as the Messiah, was the final attempt to restore Jewish sovereignty by force. It lasted 3 years. It initially succeeded in establishing an independent state with its own coins and administration, and it was crushed with a thoroughness that makes the destruction of 70 CE look restrained. Hadrian razed Jerusalem to the ground and built a new Roman city on its ruins, Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter where the temple had stood. Jews were forbidden to enter the city. The province of Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, Palestine, a deliberate act of erasure, naming the land after the ancient Philistines, the historical enemies of the Jews. The name stuck. It has been contested ever since. Rest here a moment. The destruction is behind us for now. The land is quiet in the way that lands are quiet after great violence. Not peaceful, but emptied, the silence of exhaustion rather than contentment. The olive trees survived as olive trees do. The terraces still held the soil on the hillsides. The springs still ran. The sky over Jerusalem was the same sky it had always been, pale blue in summer, heavy with cloud in winter, streaked with gold at dusk. Somewhere in the Galilee, in a small stone house, a rabbi was teaching students the law. Somewhere on the coast, a Roman soldier was writing a letter home. Somewhere in the ruins of Jerusalem, grass was growing between the stones. The land does not choose its names. It does not choose its rulers. It receives what comes and endures what it must, and it waits. It is waiting now. The empires are changing. Rome is not what it was. A new faith is rising in the east, and an older one is transforming itself to survive. The centuries ahead will bring new languages, new prayers, new walls on old foundations, but for now, silence. The soft sound of wind through dry grass, the distant bleating of a goat on a hillside, the slow turning of stars over a land that has been holy to someone for as long as anyone can remember, and that will go on being holy and fought over and wept for long after the stars themselves have shifted in their courses. Close your eyes if they are heavy. The story will be here when you return. Part 4, The Cross and the Crescent. The empire that destroyed the temple would, within 3 centuries, adopt the faith that was born in its shadow. The transformation of Rome from pagan empire to Christian state is one of the most consequential shifts in human history. And for Palestine, for the land where the events at the center of the new faith had occurred, the consequences were profound and particular. The place where Jesus had walked, taught, suffered, and died was about to become something it had never been before: a destination, a geography of devotion, a landscape read not for its soil or its water or its strategic value, but for its capacity to make sacred narrative physically real. This would change everything. The process was gradual. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, Christianity was a persecuted minority faith within the Roman Empire, and Palestine was a Roman province of modest importance. Aelia Capitolina, the city Hadrian had built on Jerusalem's ruins, was a middling Roman town with pagan temples, a military garrison, and a population that was largely Gentile. Jews were still formally barred from the city, though the prohibition was unevenly enforced. A small Christian community existed, but it was marginal, poor, and without political influence. The Jewish population had shifted northward. The Galilee became the center of Jewish intellectual life. It was here, in towns like Sepphoris and Tiberias, that the rabbis compiled the Mishnah around 200 CE, the first major written codification of Jewish oral law, organized by Rabbi Judah ha-Nasi with a precision and comprehensiveness that suggests a community determined to preserve everything it could carry from the wreckage of the temple period. The Mishnah discusses temple rituals in meticulous detail: the order of sacrifices, the duties of priests, the measurements of sacred spaces, not because these rituals were still being performed, but because recording them was itself an act of faith. The temple would be rebuilt. The rituals would resume. The law must be ready. The Jerusalem Talmud, completed around 400 CE, expanded the Mishnah with centuries of rabbinic commentary, debate, and interpretation. It is the less authoritative of the 2 Talmuds. The Babylonian Talmud, produced by the larger and more prosperous Jewish community in Mesopotamia, would become the primary guide for Jewish life. But it is the one produced on the land itself, in the landscape of the stories it discussed, by scholars who could walk the paths their ancestors had walked. Meanwhile, across the broader Roman world, Christianity was spreading. By the early 4th century, Christians constituted perhaps 10% of the empire's population. A minority, but a strategically placed one, concentrated in cities, organized in networks, and possessing a textual and institutional coherence that the fragmented pagan traditions could not match. In 312 CE, the Emperor Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and attributed his victory to the Christian god. Whether Constantine's conversion was genuine spiritual transformation or political calculation, or most likely some inseparable mixture of both, it changed the trajectory of the empire and the world. Christianity went from persecuted sect to favored religion in the space of a generation. By 380 CE, under the Emperor Theodosius, it was the official state religion. Pagan temples were closed, pagan sacrifice was banned. The Roman Empire had become, in law and in aspiration, a Christian state. For Palestine, the Constantinian Revolution meant the beginning of the age of pilgrimage. Sector free. The Holy Land. Constantine's mother, Helena, visited Palestine around 326 CE. She was elderly, devout, and armed with the resources of an empire. Her mission was to identify and mark the sites associated with the life of Jesus, to transform the landscape of Scripture into a landscape of stone and ceremony. The results were transformative. At the site identified as Golgotha and the tomb of Jesus, beneath a Roman temple to Venus that Hadrian had built, whether by coincidence or deliberate provocation, Helena and Constantine ordered the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which remains to this day the holiest site in Christendom. In Bethlehem, Over the cave identified as the birthplace of Jesus, they built the Church of the Nativity, whose basic structure still stands, making it one of the oldest continuously operating churches in the world. On the Mount of Olives, where Jesus was said to have ascended to heaven, another church rose. The identification of these sites was not, in most cases, based on rigorous evidence. 3 centuries had passed since the events in question. The population had been displaced. The city had been razed and rebuilt, and the connection between specific locations and specific gospel events depended largely on local tradition. Stories passed down through the small Christian community that had persisted in Aelia Capitolina, stories whose accuracy is impossible to verify and whose emotional truth was, for the faithful, more important than their archaeological precision. What matters is not whether Helena found the actual tomb of Jesus. What matters is that she and millions after her believed she had, and that this belief drew a river of pilgrims, donations, institutions, and imperial attention toward Palestine that reshaped the land as thoroughly as any conquest. Churches multiplied. Monasteries appeared on hilltops and in desert valleys. Pilgrims arrived from across the Roman world, from Gaul, from North Africa, from the distant edges of Britain, carrying money, faith, and a hunger to touch the ground where the sacred story had happened. The travel diary of a pilgrim known as Egeria, written around 381 CE, describes her journey through Palestine with the breathless devotion of a woman who believed she was walking through the pages of a living book. She notes the churches, the ceremonies, the locations, and the readings performed at each site, a liturgy mapped onto geography, a calendar mapped onto landscape. The economy of Palestine shifted. The land had always been a crossroads for trade, but now it was also a crossroads for faith. Pilgrimage generated wealth. In construction, hospitality, the manufacture of relics and souvenirs, the maintenance of churches and clergy. Jerusalem, which had been a provincial backwater since Hadrian's reconstruction, began to grow again. By the 5th century, it was a major Christian city, home to a patriarch who ranked among the most important churchmen in the world. But the Christianization of Palestine was not simply a story of building and devotion, it was also a story of displacement and restriction. As Christianity became the state religion, the position of Jews in Palestine and Rabbah and across the empire deteriorated. Laws increasingly restricted Jewish rights. The right to build new synagogues, the right to hold public office, the right to own Christian slaves. Jews were permitted to visit the site of the temple, now a deliberate ruin, left unbuilt as a Christian theological statement that God had abandoned the Old Covenant, only on the anniversary of its destruction, to weep. The image of Jews weeping at the ruins of their temple while Christians built magnificent churches a few hundred meters away is one of the defining images of late antique Palestine. It is an image of power and its exercise, of one community's triumph literally constructed upon another community's loss. The Christians who built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were not thinking about the Jews weeping at the Western Wall. They did not need to. That is what power means. The Samaritan community too suffered under Christian rule. In 529 CE, a Samaritan revolt against the Byzantine Emperor Justinian was suppressed with extreme violence. Tens of thousands were killed. The Samaritan population, which had been substantial, was reduced to a fraction of its former size and never recovered. Namuras. The Byzantine centuries. The Roman Empire split formally in 395 CE, and Palestine fell within the eastern half. The Byzantine Empire, as later historians would call it, though its inhabitants called themselves Romans until the end. For the next 2.5 centuries, Palestine was a Byzantine province, governed from Constantinople, increasingly Greek in its administrative language, thoroughly Christian in its public culture. These were, by the standards of Palestine's turbulent history, relatively quiet centuries. The great theological controversies of the age, the nature of Christ, the relationship between his human and divine aspects, the proper formulation of the Trinity, were debated fiercely in councils and churches across the empire, and Palestine's monasteries and bishops participated actively. But the debates were fought with words, with excommunications, with imperial edicts, not with armies in the field. The land itself was productive. Archaeological surveys of the Byzantine period show a peak of settlement density in Palestine. More villages, more farms, more churches, more people than at almost any previous point in history. The terraced hillsides of the Central Highlands were intensively cultivated. The Negev, which today appears barren, was farmed using sophisticated systems of water collection. Channels cut into hillsides to direct seasonal runoff into fields and cisterns that supported towns of several thousand people in landscapes that now support only Bedouin camps and military installations. The mosaics of Byzantine Palestine are among the most beautiful surviving works of late antique art. At a church in Madaba in modern Jordan, a 6th century mosaic map depicts the entire Holy Land in vivid detail. Jerusalem at the center, its colonnaded main street clearly visible, churches and landmarks identified by name. It is the oldest surviving cartographic representation of Palestine, and it shows a land that its makers knew intimately and loved. At a synagogue in Sepphoris, a mosaic floor depicts the zodiac, the binding of Isaac, and the ritual objects of the temple, menorah, shofar, incense shovel, in a style that blends Jewish iconography with Greco-Roman artistic conventions. The Jews of Byzantine Palestine were a diminished minority, legally restricted and socially marginalized, but they had not disappeared. They maintained synagogues, studied Torah, and produced works of art that expressed their continued attachment to the land and to the religious traditions that had sustained them through catastrophe. The two communities, Christian and Jewish, coexisted on the same land, praying to the same God in different languages, reading overlapping but divergent scriptures, honoring many of the same places for different reasons. It was not equal coexistence. The power was entirely on one side. But it was coexistence, and it produced a landscape layered with meaning in a way that no other territory on earth could match. Every hill, every spring, every cave claimed by someone, narrated by someone, sacred to someone. In 614 CE, the quiet ended abruptly. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival to the east, launched a massive invasion of the Byzantine Near East. Persian armies swept through Syria, took Damascus, and entered Palestine. Jerusalem fell after a brief siege. The true cross, what the relic Helena was said to have discovered, the most sacred object in Christendom, was carried off to the Persian capital at Ctesiphon. The Jewish population of Palestine, according to Christian sources, aided the Persian invaders. After centuries of Byzantine restriction, some Jews apparently saw the Persians as liberators. The Christian sources describe Jewish participation in the destruction of churches and the massacre of Christians, though the details and scale are disputed. What is less disputed is that the brief period of Persian control, roughly 614 to 628 CE, gave the Jewish community a taste of relief from Byzantine oppression, including, some sources suggest, permission to worship on the Temple Mount for the first time in centuries. It did not last. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius reconquered Palestine in 628 CE, recovered the true cross, and restored Christian authority. The Jews who had collaborated with the Persians faced retribution. Heraclius reportedly ordered forced conversions and expulsions, but the Byzantine restoration was itself fleeting. Heraclius had exhausted his empire in the long war with Persia. Both empires, Byzantine and Sassanid, emerged from their decades of conflict weakened, depleted, and unprepared for what was coming. In the deserts of Arabia, a new force was gathering. The coming of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad died in Medina in 632 CE. He had unified most of the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of a new monotheistic faith that claimed to complete and correct the revelations given to the Jews and Christians before it. Islam, submission to the will of God, recognized Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, and Jesus as prophets. It revered Jerusalem as the place from which Muhammad had ascended to heaven during the night journey, the Isra and Mi'raj. It carried within it, from its very inception a relationship to the land of Palestine that was theological, not merely territorial. The armies that emerged from Arabia in the years after Muhammad's death moved with a speed that astonished the world. The Arab conquest of the Near East is one of the most rapid and consequential military campaigns in human history. Within a decade, the Sassanid Empire was destroyed entirely. The Byzantine Empire lost its richest provinces, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, North Africa, and was reduced to Anatolia and the Balkans. A civilization that had taken a millennium to build was dismantled in a generation. The conquest of Palestine came early. In 634 CE, Arab armies under the command of generals like Khalid ibn al-Walid and Amr ibn al-As entered the territory from the south and east. The Battle of Ajnadain, probably fought southwest of Jerusalem in 634, was the first major engagement. The Byzantine forces were defeated. Town after town submitted, some after brief resistance, others by negotiation. Jerusalem held out longer. The city was besieged in 636 or 637, the exact chronology is uncertain, and its patriarch Sophronius eventually negotiated a surrender directly with the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who traveled from Medina to accept the city's capitulation in person. The story of Umar's entry into Jerusalem is one of the most celebrated episodes in Islamic historiography. According to the traditional accounts, Umar entered the city on foot, or perhaps on a camel, dressed in simple garments, deliberately modest in contrast to the pomp of the Byzantine rulers he was replacing. Sophronius is said to have shown him the major Christian sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the time for Muslim prayer arrived. Umar reportedly declined to pray inside the church, explaining that if he did, future Muslims would claim the site as a mosque. He prayed outside instead. The story may be embellished. Most foundational stories are, but it encodes a principle that, in its broad outlines, characterized early Islamic rule in Palestine. The existing religious communities, Christian and Jewish, were to be permitted to continue their worship, maintain their institutions, and govern their internal affairs in exchange for submission to Muslim political authority and the payment of a special tax, the jizya. This arrangement, formalized in Islamic law as the dhimmi system, was neither equality nor persecution. It was something in between. A hierarchical coexistence in which non-Muslims were protected but subordinate, tolerated but taxed, permitted to exist but reminded, through legal and social markers, that they existed at the sufferance of the ruling faith. By the standards of 7th century religious politics, it was relatively generous. The Byzantines had offered Jews and heterodox Christians considerably less. By the standards of modern human rights, it was discriminatory. Both assessments are true. Neither is complete without the other. Umar also visited the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary as it would become known in Arabic. He found it, according to some accounts, in a state of deliberate neglect. The Byzantines had used it as a garbage dump, a gesture of theological contempt toward the Jewish temple that had once stood there. Umar ordered it cleaned. Within decades, the first structures of what would become the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock were under construction. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 CE under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik, is one of the most beautiful buildings on earth. Its golden dome, originally lead, later gilded, rises above an octagonal base sheathed in blue and green tiles covered with Quranic inscriptions. At its center, beneath the dome, lies the exposed bedrock of Mount Moriah, the rock where, in Jewish tradition, Abraham bound Isaac for sacrifice, and where, in Islamic tradition, Muhammad began his ascent to heaven. The building is a theological statement inscribed in stone and gold. Its Quranic inscriptions explicitly address Christians, affirming Jesus as a prophet while denying his divinity. God is only one God. Far be it from his glory that he should have a son. It was built on the site most sacred to Judaism, in a city sacred to Christianity, by the newest of the three faiths, and it announced, with breathtaking architectural confidence, that Islam was the culmination and correction of what had come before. The Dome of the Rock has stood for over 1,300 years. It has survived earthquakes, Crusaders, Mongol invasions, Ottoman renovations, and the modern conflict. It remains the most recognizable structure in Jerusalem, the building that defines the city's silhouette, the image that appears on posters and postcards and protest signs. It is magnificent. It is contested. It is, like everything in this city, impossible to separate from the layers of claim and counterclaim that surround it. The early Islamic period. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled from Damascus from 661 to 750 CE, Palestine was part of the administrative district of Falastin, the use of the old name a striking continuity. The region was governed as a province of a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. Arabic gradually replaced Greek and Aramaic as the language of administration and, over the centuries, of daily life. Islam spread, not primarily through forced conversion, which was rare, but through the slower processes of social advantage, intermarriage, and cultural assimilation. Converting to Islam meant escaping the jizya tax, gaining full legal standing, and entering the dominant social group. Over the centuries, the majority of Palestine's population became Muslim, though significant Christian and smaller Jewish minorities persisted. The population that converted was, in most cases, the same population that had been there before. This is a point that bears emphasis because it is often lost in narratives that treat the Arab conquest as a replacement of one population with another. The farmers who worked the terraced hillsides of the Central Highlands in the 8th century were, in many cases, the descendants of the farmers who had worked those same hillsides in the 6th century and the 4th and the 2nd. They had changed their language, their religion, their political allegiance. They had not changed their land. The olive trees they tended did not care what language the farmer spoke or in which direction he prayed. This is one of the deep continuities of Palestine. The persistence of the rural population beneath the successive waves of conquest, conversion, and cultural transformation. Empires came and went. Languages changed. Religions changed. The people who worked the soil, the fellahin, the peasant farmers, endured. Their bloodlines carried the accumulated genetics of everyone who had ever settled the land. Canaanite, Israelite, Philistine, Persian, Greek, Roman, Arab. They were not purely anything. They were the land's own people, shaped by it as they had shaped it. In 750 CE, the Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown by the Abbasid Revolution, and the center of the Islamic world shifted east to Baghdad. Palestine, which had been close to the Umayyad capital in Damascus, now found itself on the periphery of an empire focused on Mesopotamia and Iran. The province became quieter, less strategically central, governed by local appointees who sent taxes to Baghdad and were otherwise left largely alone. The Abbasid period, roughly 750 to 969 CE in Palestine, was not a golden age for the region, but neither was it a dark one. The economy functioned. Agriculture continued. The cities, Jerusalem, Ramla, a new city founded by the Umayyads as the provincial capital, Gaza, Nablus, Tiberias, maintained their populations and their commerce. The geographer Al-Muqaddasi, writing in the late 10th century, was himself a native of Jerusalem and described Palestine with the mixed pride and frustration of a local son. The land was blessed, the fruits were excellent, the scholars were learned, but the administration was corrupt, the taxes were heavy, and the bathhouses were not as good as those in Baghdad. Al-Muqaddasi's account is valuable precisely because it is ordinary. He describes a functioning society in corridors, markets, mosques, churches, synagogues, scholars debating, merchants trading, farmers complaining about taxes. It is a corrective to the tendency in Western historical narratives to treat the Islamic centuries of Palestine as a blank space between the Bible and the Crusades, as though the land were merely waiting, holding its sacred places in trust until Europeans arrived to give it significance again. The land was not waiting. It was lived in. It was argued over, cultivated, built upon, prayed in, written about. Its people had their own concerns, their own disputes, their own sense of what the land meant. The fact that Western historiography has often treated these centuries as unimportant says more about Western historiography than about the centuries. The Fatimid Interlude. In 969 CE, Palestine passed from Abbasid control to the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty based in Cairo that had conquered Egypt and was expanding eastward. The Fatimids were, by the standards of the age, relatively tolerant rulers. Their empire included large Christian and Jewish populations, and their administration employed officials of all faiths. The exception came in the person of the Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, who ruled from 996 to 1021 CE, and whose erratic behavior has puzzled historians for a millennium. In 1009, al-Hakim ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The church was razed to its foundations. The rock-cut tomb believed to be the burial place of Jesus was hacked away. The motives are unclear. Al-Hakim issued a series of decrees restricting Christians and Jews, banning the display of crosses, requiring distinctive clothing, prohibiting certain religious practices. But he also issued contradictory orders and eventually persecuted members of his own Sunni Muslim population as well. He may have been mentally unstable, he may have been pursuing a coherent, if extreme, theological agenda. He disappeared in 1021 while walking in the hills outside Cairo, whether murdered, escaped, or, as his followers believed, taken directly into divine occultation. And his successors reversed most of his policies. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt, with Byzantine financial assistance, in the decades that followed. But the memory of its destruction lingered in European consciousness, feeding a narrative of Muslim persecution of Christians in the Holy Land that would, decades later, provide one of the justifications or pretexts for the most dramatic intervention in Palestine's medieval history. The Crusades were coming. In the closing decades of the 11th century, two events converged to set the stage. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks defeated the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert, shattering Byzantine control over Anatolia and throwing the Eastern Christian world into crisis. The Byzantine emperor appealed to the West for military assistance. And in 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at the Council of Clermont and issued a call that would reshape the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. The speech itself was not recorded verbatim. We have only later reconstructions, each shaped by the agenda of its author, but the substance is consistent across sources. Urban described the suffering of Eastern Christians at the hands of the Turks. He spoke of the desecration of the holy places. He offered the remission of sins to those who took up the cross and marched to liberate Jerusalem. He appealed to the martial culture of the European aristocracy, redirecting the violence of feudal warfare toward an external enemy. He spoke of a duty owed to God and to the land where Christ had walked. The response was overwhelming. Across France, Germany, Italy, and England, thousands took the cross. Not only knights and nobles, but peasants, merchants, women, children, the devout and the desperate and the opportunistic. They sewed crosses onto their garments. They sold their property. They marched east. They would arrive in Palestine in 1099, and what they did there would leave a mark on the land and on the relationship between the Christian and Muslim world that has not yet faded. But that is the next chapter. Let the 11th century settle. The land is still here, still layered, still patient beneath its accumulating centuries of prayer and claim. The dome of the rock catches the last light. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rebuilt but bearing the scars of its destruction, stands in the crowded heart of the old city. Somewhere in the Jewish quarter, a family lights Sabbath candles as their ancestors did 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, in this same city that will not let them go and will not let them rest. 3 faiths. 1 city. A story that is already ancient and nowhere near finished. The wind carries the sound of the muezzin's call across the rooftops, mingling with church bells, settling into the stones. Rest here. The Crusaders are still on the road. You will hear their horses soon enough. Part 5. Empires of Sand. They came from the west, as so many conquerors of this land had before them, but they came on foot, and they came with a fervor that the land had not seen since the armies of the first caliphs poured out of the Arabian desert 4 centuries earlier. The First Crusade reached the walls of Jerusalem on June 7, 1099. The army that arrived was a remnant of the perhaps 60 to 100,000 who had set out from Europe 3 years earlier. Only 12 to 15,000 remained. The rest lost to battle, disease, starvation, and the brutal overland march through Anatolia and Syria. They had fought their way through hostile territory for over 1,000 miles. They had taken Antioch after an 8-month siege. They had eaten their horses, then their leather, then at Ma'ara in Syria, according to multiple sources, including their own chroniclers, the flesh of their dead enemies. The men who stood before Jerusalem in June 1099 were not the same men who had left Europe. They were thinner, harder, fewer, and more desperate. They were also, by their own account, consumed with a religious intensity that bordered on ecstasy. They were about to enter the city where Christ had died and risen. Many believed they were enacting the final chapter of sacred history. Some expected the second coming to follow the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. The siege lasted 5 weeks. The Fatimid garrison was small, but the walls were strong, and the Crusaders lacked siege equipment and, critically, water. The summer heat of the Judean hills in July is punishing, and the defenders had poisoned the wells outside the city. Crusader soldiers drank the blood of their slaughtered animals. Then ships arrived at Jaffa with timber and supplies. Siege towers were constructed. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders breached the northern wall. Godfrey of Bouillon's men were among the first over. The defenders fell back. The gates were opened. What followed was a massacre. The sources, Latin, Arabic, and Jewish, agree on the essential fact, though they differ on the scale. The Crusaders killed indiscriminately. Muslims were cut down in the streets, in their houses, in the mosques. The Jewish community was herded into a synagogue and burned alive. The Gesta Francorum, a Latin chronicle written by a participant, describes crusaders wading through blood up to their ankles in the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, where fleeing Muslims had sought refuge. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, writing a century later, placed the number of dead at 70,000, though this is almost certainly exaggerated. Modern estimates suggest several thousand to tens of thousands killed, depending on the source and the method of calculation. The precise number matters less than the event itself. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 was experienced across the Muslim world as a trauma, a violation of one of Islam's holiest cities by foreign invaders of shocking brutality. It entered the collective memory of the Islamic world in a way that has never fully faded. When modern Arab and Muslim leaders invoke the Crusades, and they do frequently, they are reaching for this memory, this wound, this precedent. The Crusaders, for their part, wept with joy. They processed through streets still slick with blood to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they prostrated themselves before the tomb of Christ and sang hymns. They had fulfilled their vow. Jerusalem was theirs. They believed God had given it to them. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in the aftermath of the conquest, was a peculiar entity. A feudal European state transplanted onto Near Eastern soil, governed by French-speaking Catholic aristocrats, defended by military monastic orders, sustained by Italian maritime commerce, and surrounded on all sides by Muslim powers that never fully accepted its presence. At its greatest extent, the Crusader territories encompassed a strip of coastline from Beirut to Gaza, the hill country around Jerusalem, parts of the Jordan Valley, and a network of castles stretching into what is now southern Lebanon and western Jordan. The total Latin Christian population was never large, perhaps 50 to 100,000 at its peak, in a territory whose overall population was several hundred thousand. The Crusaders were a ruling minority, governing a population of Muslim and Eastern Christian peasants who continued to farm the same land, tend the same orchting trees, and pay taxes to new masters. The architecture they left behind is remarkable. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre as it stands today is largely a Crusader construction. The Romanesque facade, the bell tower, the unified interior space that brought together the separate Byzantine chapels into a single building. Crusader castles, Belvoir overlooking the Jordan Valley, Montfort in the western Galilee, the vast fortification at Kerak in modern Jordan, are among the most impressive military structures of the medieval world. They built churches, hospitals, markets, and sugar processing facilities. They imported European feudal law, adapted to local conditions. They created a functioning state. They also created a society of remarkable cultural complexity. The second and third generation Crusaders, those born in the East, known as Poulains, were markedly different from the European newcomers who continued to arrive on crusade. They spoke Arabic as well as French. They wore Eastern clothing. They employed Muslim servants and doctors. They bathed, which shocked newly arrived Europeans accustomed to regarding frequent bathing with suspicion. The chronicler Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian Muslim nobleman who had extensive dealings with the Crusaders, described them with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. Barbarians in their customs, ignorant in their medicine, but occasionally capable of honor and even friendship. This cultural accommodation, however, operated within a framework of fundamental inequality. The Crusader states were Catholic institutions. Muslims had no political rights. Jews had no political rights. Eastern Christians, the Orthodox, the Armenians, the Syriacs, were tolerated but subordinated. The Holy Sepulchre was controlled by the Latin Rite. The Temple Mount was converted into a Christian complex. The Al-Aqsa Mosque became the headquarters of the Knights Templar, and the Dome of the Rock was reimagined as the Templum Domini, capped with a cross. For the Muslim population of Palestine, the Crusader period was an occupation. Their mosques were converted. Their legal status was inferior. Their sacred spaces were appropriated. The fact that some Crusaders learned Arabic and employed Muslim doctors does not change the structural reality. Coexistence and domination are not mutually exclusive. They coexisted in the Crusader states as they have coexisted in every colonial society. Ninuwas. Saladin. The Muslim counterattack, when it came, was led by a man whose name would become legendary in both the Islamic and the European traditions, though for different reasons. Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, was not an Arab. He was a Kurd, born in Tikrit in modern Iraq, raised in the service of the Zengid dynasty in Syria, and elevated to power through a combination of military talent, political shrewdness, and the kind of patient, methodical ambition that this land's history tends to reward more than reckless courage. By 1187, Saladin had unified Egypt and much of Syria under his control, a strategic encirclement of the Crusader states that previous Muslim leaders had attempted but never achieved. The Crusader kingdom, meanwhile, was weakened by internal divisions, succession disputes, and the reckless aggression of Raynald of Chatillon, a Crusader lord who attacked Muslim pilgrim caravans and Red Sea shipping, violating truces and provoking a conflict that more cautious Crusader leaders had sought to avoid. On July 4th, 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, a rocky hilltop west of the Sea of Galilee, Saladin destroyed the Crusader army in the most decisive battle of the entire Crusader era. The Crusaders had marched across waterless terrain in July heat, arriving at the battlefield exhausted and dehydrated. Saladin's forces surrounded them, set fire to the dry brush, and attacked through the smoke. The king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, was captured. The true cross, which the Crusaders carried into battle as a talisman, was taken. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, the shock troops of the Crusader states, were largely annihilated. Saladin personally executed Raynald of Chatillon. In the weeks that followed, Crusader cities and castles fell in rapid succession. Acre, Jaffa, Beirut, Sidon, Nablus, Jericho, the entire kingdom collapsed. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. Saladin's conduct at the fall of Jerusalem stands in deliberate and self-conscious contrast to the Crusader conquest of 1099. There was no massacre. The population was permitted to ransom themselves, those who could pay, left freely. Those who could not were technically enslaved, though Saladin freed many without payment, and his brother Al-Adil freed 1,000 more. The churches were not destroyed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained in Christian hands. Eastern Christians were permitted to stay and worship freely. The dome of the rock was purified with rosewater. The cross was removed from its summit. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was restored to Muslim worship. A magnificent wooden minbar, commissioned by Saladin's predecessor Nur al-Din decades earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment, was installed in the mosque. It remained there for 8 centuries, until an Australian tourist set fire to it in 1969. Saladin's magnanimity at Jerusalem was genuine, but it was also strategic. He was acutely aware of the propaganda value of mercy. The contrast with 1099 was a message to the Muslim world and to Christendom alike. We are not what you are. We do not do what you did. The moral claim reinforced the military victory. The Crusaders were not finished. The Third Crusade, launched in response to the fall of Jerusalem, brought Richard the Lionheart of England to Palestine in 1191. Richard was a formidable general. He retook Acre after a brutal siege and defeated Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf, but he could not retake Jerusalem. After months of campaign, the two leaders negotiated a truce. The Crusaders retained a strip of coastline, and Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe access to Jerusalem. Richard and Saladin never met in person, but the stories of their chivalric rivalry, the mutual respect, the gifts exchanged during Richard's illness, the offers of ice and fruit became the stuff of medieval legend in both cultures. Whether the stories are true matters less than what they reveal. A desire on both sides to see in the enemy a worthy counterpart, to frame the conflict not as mere butchery, but as a contest between civilized antagonists. The reality, as always, was more brutal than the legend. The siege of Acre involved the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners by Richard's forces, a mass killing carried out in full view of Saladin's army when ransom negotiations broke down. Richard's march down the coast was accompanied by systematic destruction of crops and villages. War in the 12th century was not chivalric. It was war. The slow Crusader sunset. The Crusader states lingered for another century after Saladin, but their trajectory was inexorably downward. A brief diplomatic anomaly in 1229 saw the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II negotiate the return of Jerusalem through treaty with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Kamil, a deal that satisfied almost no one and lasted only 15 years. The city changed hands again in 1244 when Khwarezmian Turks, fleeing the Mongol advance, sacked Jerusalem and slaughtered its Christian population. The Ayyubid dynasty that Saladin had founded gave way in Egypt to the Mamluks, slave soldiers of Turkish and Circassian origin who seized power in 1250 and built a military state of remarkable effectiveness. It was the Mamluks who delivered the final blows. In 1291, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil captured Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold. The siege was fierce. The city's massive walls, reinforced over 2 centuries, held for weeks before the Mamluk assault overwhelmed them. When Acre fell, the remaining Crusader outposts were abandoned. The Latin presence in Palestine, which had lasted nearly 2 centuries, was over. The Crusaders left behind their castles, their churches, some loan words in Arabic, and a deep scar in Muslim memory. They also left behind a pattern that this land seems to reproduce. The arrival of an external power convinced of its divine or civilizational mandate that establishes itself by force, sustains itself for a time through military superiority and external support, and eventually collapses when the balance of power shifts against it. The pattern is not destiny. No pattern in history is, but it is there, visible in the archaeological record of fallen walls and abandoned fortifications, and those who live on this land have long memories. The Mamluk order. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling from Cairo, governed Palestine from 1291 to 1516. Over 2 centuries of rule that receives remarkably little attention in Western accounts of the region, sandwiched as it is between the drama of the Crusades and the spectacle of the Ottoman Empire. This neglect is itself a form of distortion. The Mamluk period shaped Palestine in ways that persisted long after the Mamluks themselves were gone. The Mamluks were military men above all. Their entire social system was built on the training, equipping, and deployment of elite cavalry. They were not administrators by inclination. They governed through a system of land grants to military officers who extracted revenue from the peasant population and were responsible for maintaining order and providing troops when called upon. The system was efficient for military purposes and indifferent to the welfare of the cultivators who sustained it. Palestine, under the Mamluks, was not a priority province. It was too small, too far from the centers of Mamluk power, and too economically marginal to command sustained attention from Cairo. The land was governed by a series of appointed officials whose quality varied enormously. Some were competent administrators, others were extractive opportunists who bled the population and moved on. Yet the Mamluk period also brought a physical transformation of Jerusalem that remains visible today. The Mamluks were prolific builders, not of palaces or fortifications for the most part, but of religious and educational institutions. The old city of Jerusalem is dense with Mamluk architecture: madrasas, hospices, mausoleums, fountains, and covered markets, many of them lining the approach streets to the Haram al-Sharif. The architecture is restrained and elegant: dressed stone, muqarnas, vaulting, geometric carved decoration, and it gives the Muslim quarter of the old city much of its present character. The Mamluks also reinforced Jerusalem's status as an Islamic holy city. Scholars and mystics were encouraged to settle there. Sufi lodges were established. Endowments, waqf, were created to fund mosques, schools, and charitable institutions. The city attracted pilgrims and students from across the Islamic world. For the Mamluk sultans, Jerusalem was a prestige project, a city whose spiritual significance enhanced the legitimacy of the dynasty that maintained it. For the Christian and Jewish minorities, the Mamluk period was one of continued but constrained existence. The dhimmi system remained in force. Christians and Jews paid the jizya, wore distinctive clothing when required to, and were subject to periodic humiliations: restrictions on building, requirements to dismount from horses in the presence of Muslims, occasional confiscation of property. The severity of enforcement varied with the temperament of individual rulers. Some Mamluk sultans were relatively tolerant. Others, particularly in times of political stress or military threat, tightened restrictions sharply. The Jewish community in Palestine during the Mamluk period was small, perhaps a few thousand in total, concentrated in Jerusalem, Safed, Hebron, and Tiberias. It was a community sustained less by local vitality than by immigration from abroad, Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, or drawn by religious devotion to live in the Holy Land. In 1267, the great Rabbi Nachmanides, Ramban, arrived in Jerusalem from Spain and found, by his account, only 2 Jewish families in the entire city. He established a synagogue and a small community. His presence helped revive Jewish settlement, but the numbers remained modest. Safed in the Galilee would become the more important center of Jewish life, particularly after 1492, when the expulsion of Jews from Spain sent a wave of refugees eastward. These Spanish Jews, Sephardim, brought with them a rich tradition of philosophy, poetry, mysticism, and legal scholarship. Safed in the 16th century would become the center of Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition, and the home of figures like Isaac Luria, whose teachings reshaped Jewish spirituality for centuries. But that was in the future. For now, the Mamluk centuries passed, not quietly, not without hardship, but without the catastrophic ruptures that had marked earlier periods. The land was farmed, the cities functioned, the 3 religious communities maintained their uneasy coexistence, The olive trees grew, the seasons turned, and then the Ottomans came. The Ottoman Dawn. In 1516, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, known as Selim the Grim, a title he earned, defeated the Mamluk army at the Battle of Marj Dabik in northern Syria, and in a single campaign annexed the entire Mamluk domain: Syria, Palestine, Egypt, the Hejaz. The Mamluks, who had held power for over 2.5 centuries, were swept away in months. Palestine changed hands once more. The Ottoman Empire was, in 1516, at or near the peak of its power. It was the largest and most powerful state in the Mediterranean world, stretching from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. It was governed from Istanbul, the old Byzantine Constantinople, by a sultan who claimed the title of caliph, protector of the Islamic holy places, and shadow of God on earth. Its administration was sophisticated, its military formidable, its court culture a synthesis of Turkish, Persian, and Arab traditions that produced architecture, poetry, and decorative arts of extraordinary refinement. Palestine, under the Ottomans, was organized into several administrative districts, sanjaks, that were eventually grouped under the province of Damascus and later under other configurations as the empire's administrative geography shifted. Jerusalem itself held a special status, governed at various times directly from Istanbul. The population at the time of the Ottoman conquest was modest, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 for the entirety of Palestine, a fraction of what the land had supported in Roman or Byzantine times. The first great Ottoman builder in Palestine was Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim's son, who reigned from 1520 to 1566 and presided over what is generally regarded as the empire's golden age. Suleiman rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, or the walls that still surround the old city today, the walls that tourists photograph and pilgrims touch, the walls that define what the world pictures when it thinks of Jerusalem. They were completed in 1541, built of the same golden limestone that has always been Jerusalem's signature material, and they enclosed roughly the same area that Hadrian's Aelia Capitolina had occupied 14 centuries earlier. Suleiman also rebuilt the citadel, restored several gates, and improved the city's water supply. The Damascus Gate, Bab al-Amud, one of the most monumental entrances to the old city, is his work. So is the ornamental tile facade on the upper portion of the Dome of the Rock, replacing the earlier mosaic with the blue and white and green ceramic tiles that give the building its present appearance. These were not merely practical improvements. They were imperial statements. Suleiman was declaring himself the heir of Solomon. The name is not coincidental in its resonance, and the builder of the walls of the holy city was claiming a place in the sacred history of the land. The inscriptions on the gates invoke God's protection and the Sultan's piety. The walls said, "This city is ours, and we will maintain it as it deserves." For the first century of Ottoman rule, the system worked reasonably well. Taxes were collected, roads were maintained, pilgrims, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, moved through the land with relative safety. The Ottoman legal system, based on Islamic law but supplemented by the Sultan's own legislation, provided a framework for governance that was, at its best, predictable and fair. The millet system formalized the arrangement of religious communities. Each major non-Muslim group, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jewish, was organized into a millet, a semi-autonomous community governed by its own religious leaders in matters of personal law, education, and worship. The community's leader, the patriarch, the chief rabbi, was responsible to the Ottoman authorities for the behavior and taxes of his flock. The system perpetuated hierarchy and separation, but it also provided minorities with a degree of autonomy and institutional continuity that few other imperial systems matched. The long Ottoman afternoon. The centuries that followed Suleiman, the 17th, 18th, and early 19th, are often characterized as a period of Ottoman decline, and there is some truth to this characterization, though it is easily overstated. The empire did not collapse. It contracted. It lost wars that it had previously won. Its institutions grew rigid. Its provincial governance grew more corrupt and less effective. Local strongmen Warlords, tribal chiefs, ambitious governors accumulated power at the expense of the central state. In Palestine, this meant increasing insecurity. Bedouin raids on settled areas became more frequent. Banditry disrupted trade. The rural population suffered from arbitrary taxation by local officials and from the depredations of soldiers and tax farmers who extracted more than they were entitled to and remitted less to Istanbul than they should have. Villages were abandoned. Agricultural land reverted to pasture or waste. The population may have declined, but life continued. The religious communities maintained their institutions. Pilgrims still came. The markets of Jerusalem, Nablus, Hebron, and Gaza still functioned. The Fellahin still plowed and planted and harvested. The olive oil of Palestine was still exported. The soap factories of Nablus, famous across the Ottoman world for their product, made from olive oil and the alkaline ash of local plants, continued to operate as some of them do to this day. The 18th century saw the rise of a remarkable local ruler, Zahir al-Umar, a Bedouin chief who carved out a semi-independent principality in the Galilee with his capital at Acre. Zahir encouraged agriculture, attracted settlers, improved security, and turned Acre into a prosperous trading port. He was eventually crushed by the Ottomans in 1775, but his legacy persisted in the physical infrastructure he had built, and in the memory of a brief period when Palestine was governed not from Istanbul or Cairo, but from within. His successor in Acre was even more dramatic. Ahmad al-Jazar, the Butcher, was a Bosnian-born Mamluk who rose to become governor of the Sidon province and ruler of much of Palestine. Al-Jazar was brutal, capable, and flamboyantly independent. He built the great mosque in Acre that bears his name, a graceful Ottoman structure with a green dome that still dominates the old city's skyline. And in 1799, he achieved something that would echo across Europe. He stopped Napoleon. Napoleon at the Walls Bonaparte arrived in Palestine in early 1799, marching north from Egypt with an army of 13,000. He had conquered Egypt the previous year as part of a grand strategic vision to threaten British India, to establish France as a Mediterranean power, to do what Alexander had done, but with artillery. He took Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. At Jaffa, his troops massacred several thousand Ottoman prisoners after promising them safe conduct, an atrocity that stained his reputation even among his admirers. Then he reached Acre. The siege lasted 2 months, from March to May 1799. Al-Jazar, assisted by a British naval squadron under Sir Sidney Smith and a handful of British military advisors, held the city against repeated French assaults. The fortifications were strong. The British fleet cut Napoleon's supply lines by sea. Plague broke out among the French troops. Assault after assault was repelled. On May 20th, 1799, Napoleon lifted the siege and retreated to Egypt. It was one of his few unambiguous military failures, and it had consequences that extended far beyond Palestine. Had Acre fallen, Napoleon might have marched on Damascus, on Istanbul, perhaps on India. The world that emerged from the Napoleonic Wars might have looked different in ways that are impossible to calculate. Instead, Palestine remained Ottoman. The walls of Acre held, and the land returned to its familiar quiet, the quiet of a province far from the centers of power, where farmers tended fields and fishermen cast nets and the centuries accumulated like sediment in a riverbed. But the 19th century would not permit Palestine to remain quiet for long. Forces were gathering. In Europe, in the Ottoman capital, in the imaginations of people who had never set foot on this soil but who believed, with varying degrees of conviction and varying definitions of the term, that it belonged to them. The modern age was approaching. With it came ideas that the land had never encountered before: nationalism, colonialism, self-determination, and the belief, revolutionary and dangerous, that a people defined by shared language, culture, and history had the right to govern themselves on their own soil. The question of whose soil this was and whose people belonged to it was about to become the defining question of Palestine's existence. It has not been answered yet. Rest here a moment. The Ottoman centuries are long, and we have moved through them quickly, too quickly perhaps for the lives that filled them. Somewhere in the hills above Nablus, a woman is pressing olives in a stone mill that her grandmother used and her grandmother before her. The oil runs golden into clay jars. The scent fills the room, rich, peppery, ancient. In Hebron, a glassblower shapes molten glass on the end of a pipe, producing the blue and green vessels that have been made in this city for centuries. In Safed, an old man bends over a manuscript, copying Kabbalistic texts by the light of an oil lamp, his pen scratching softly in the silence. The land is still here. The people are still here. The empires change above them like weather. Soon the weather will change again, faster and more violently than ever before. The 19th century is about to begin, and with it, the forces that will produce the modern conflict. The conflict that has no resolution, only a history, and that history is what we are trying carefully and gently to tell. But not yet. Not quite yet. Let the olive oil settle in its jars. Let the glassblower finish his work. Let the old man complete his page. The morning will be complicated enough. Part 6. The Mandate and the Fracture. The war that was supposed to end all wars ended the Ottoman Empire instead. On October 31, 1918, the Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros, and an empire that had governed Palestine for 402 years ceased to exist. The land was already in British hands. General Edmund Allenby had entered Jerusalem on December 11, 1917. On foot, deliberately, having dismounted from his horse outside the Jaffa Gate, in a gesture calculated to contrast with the Kaiser's mounted entry 20 years earlier. The symbolism was clear: humility, respect, a conqueror who understood the weight of the city he was entering. Allenby's entry was choreographed, but the document that would determine Palestine's future had been issued 5 weeks before he walked through that gate, and it had been composed not in Jerusalem but in London, in a language of diplomatic ambiguity so precise that lawyers and historians have been parsing it ever since. The Balfour Declaration. 67 words that changed the world. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. A national home, not a state. The word was deliberately avoided. In Palestine, not of Palestine. The civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, but not their political rights, and those existing non-Jewish communities constituted, at the time the declaration was issued, approximately 90% of Palestine's population. The declaration was a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. It had been drafted and redrafted over months with input from Zionist leaders, British cabinet members, and, notably, almost no one who actually lived in Palestine, Arab or Jewish. It was, as the writer Arthur Koestler later observed, a document in which one nation promised to a second nation the country of a third. Why did Britain issue it? The motives were multiple and tangled. Genuine sympathy for Zionist aspirations existed in parts of the British establishment, rooted in a Christian tradition of philo-Semitism that saw the return of the Jews to the Holy Land as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Strategic calculation played a larger role. The British believed that a pro-British Jewish entity in Palestine would help secure the Suez Canal and the land route to India. There was also a wildly inflated belief in Jewish global influence. British policymakers imagined that a gesture towards Zionism would rally Jewish support for the Allied cause in the United States and, more fancifully, keep Russian Jews loyal to the war effort in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. None of these calculations proved accurate, but the declaration was made, and it could not be unmade. The architecture of contradiction. In April 1920, the Allied powers met at San Remo and assigned Britain the mandate over Palestine, a new form of imperial administration, theoretically temporary, in which the mandatory power was charged with preparing the territory for eventual self-governance. The terms of the mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration by reference. Britain was thus legally obligated to facilitate Jewish immigration and settlement while simultaneously protecting the rights of the existing population. The contradiction was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. The population of Palestine at the start of the mandate was approximately 750,000, of whom roughly 600,000 were Muslim Arab, 70,000 were Christian Arab, and 60,000 were Jewish. The Jewish population included both the old Yishuv, communities that had lived in Palestine for centuries, concentrated in the four holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias, largely devout and non-political, and the newer Zionist immigrants of the First and Second Aliyah, who had arrived between the 1880s and 1914 with an explicitly political project, the creation of a Jewish national entity on this land. The Arab population was overwhelmingly rural, agrarian, and rooted in patterns of life that had persisted for centuries. The fellahin, the peasant farmers, worked land that was often owned by absentee landlords based in Beirut or Damascus, under tenure arrangements that ranged from formal ownership to customary use rights that had never been legally registered. The urban elite, the notable families of Jerusalem, Nablus, Haifa, and Jaffa, dominated political and economic life. Arab society was divided by clan, region, religion, and class in ways that would hamper collective political action throughout the Mandate period. The British, arriving with the confidence of a power that had just won a world war and administered a quarter of the globe, believed they could manage these competing claims through good governance, even-handedness, and the gradual modernization of Palestinian society. They were wrong, but it took them 30 years to admit it. The first decade of the Mandate saw the institutional foundations laid. A High Commissioner, appointed from London, governed from the Augusta Victoria compound on the Mount of Olives, later from Government House on the Hill of Evil Counsel, a name that subsequent events would render either ironic or prophetic, depending on one's perspective. A civil administration was established, with departments for education, health, public works, and land registration. Courts were created, police were recruited, roads were built, malaria was fought. The Jewish community, the Yishuv, built its own parallel institutions with remarkable speed and organizational skill. The Jewish agency served as a proto-government, managing immigration, land purchase, and relations with the mandatory authority. The Histadrut, the General Federation of Jewish Workers, was founded in 1920 and became far more than a labor union. It ran schools, hospitals, construction companies, an agricultural marketing cooperative, and eventually a paramilitary organization. Hebrew was revived as a spoken language, one of the most successful cases of linguistic revival in history, transforming a liturgical and literary language into a living tongue used for buying groceries, arguing with neighbors, and singing children to sleep. The Zionist movement purchased land legally through the Jewish National Fund and private investors, refers, often from the absentee landlords who owned large tracts. The purchases were legal. They were also in many cases devastating to the tenant farmers who had worked the land for generations and who found themselves evicted by new owners whose explicit goal was to create Jewish-only agricultural settlements. The policy of avodah ivrit, Hebrew labor, meant that Jewish farms and enterprises would employ only Jewish workers, creating a separate economic sphere that excluded the Arab population. The dispossessed fellahin had nowhere to go. They drifted to the cities, to the shanty margins of Haifa and Jaffa, to an emerging class of landless laborers whose resentment would fuel the growing nationalist movement. They had lost their land not through conquest but through purchase, a distinction that was legally meaningful and emotionally meaningless. The gathering storm tensions erupted early and repeatedly. In 1920, during the Nebi Musa festival in Jerusalem, Arab crowds attacked Jewish residents, killing 5 and injuring over 200. In 1921, riots in Jaffa killed 47 Jews and 48 Arabs. In 1929, the most serious violence yet engulfed Palestine. Triggered by disputes over Jewish access to the Western Wall, which stood at the base of the Haram al-Sharif, sacred to both faiths, mobs attacked Jewish communities across the country. In Hebron, 67 Jews were murdered by their Arab neighbors in a massacre of intimate savagery. Families hacked to death in their homes, rabbinical students killed in their yeshiva. Some Hebron Arabs sheltered Jewish families at risk to their own lives, and this should be remembered alongside the killing. But the ancient Jewish community of Hebron, which had existed for centuries, was destroyed. The survivors were evacuated by the British and did not return for decades. The British responded to each outbreak of violence with a commission of inquiry, and each commission reached essentially the same conclusion: that Arab violence was driven by fear of Zionist immigration and land purchase, that the two communities' aspirations were fundamentally incompatible, and that some limitation on Jewish immigration might be necessary to maintain order. The Zionist leadership rejected any limitation. The Arab leadership rejected any level of Jewish immigration that served the goal of a national home. The British, caught between their contradictory commitments, tried to satisfy both sides and satisfied neither. The 1930s brought acceleration. In Germany, the Nazi rise to power in 1933 produced a surge of Jewish immigration to Palestine, the Fifth Aliyah, that transformed the demographic balance. Between 1932 and 1936, the Jewish population of Palestine roughly doubled, from 175,000 to over 370,000. The newcomers were different from earlier waves. Many were educated, urban, middle-class Germans who brought capital, professional skills, and a desperate urgency that previous immigrants had lacked. They had not chosen Palestine from a menu of options. They had been driven to it by the closing of every alternative. Tel Aviv, founded in 1909 as a garden suburb of Jaffa, exploded in size. Bauhaus-trained architects from Germany designed apartment buildings and commercial blocks in the international style, producing the White City, a concentration of modernist architecture so significant that it would later be designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A European city was materializing on the Mediterranean coast, complete with cafes, concert halls, newspapers, and a cultural life conducted entirely in Hebrew. It was a remarkable achievement of collective will. It was also seen from the Arab villages that surrounded it, a visible and expanding confirmation that the land was being taken. The Arab Revolt. In April 1936, the Arab population of Palestine rose in the most sustained and organized rebellion the Mandate had yet faced. The Great Arab Revolt, as it came to be known, lasted 3 years and constituted the first major Palestinian national uprising. It began as a general strike, a coordinated refusal to work, to pay taxes, to cooperate with the mandatory government. Arab leaders formed the Arab Higher Committee, chaired by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and demanded 3 things: an end to Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales to Jews, and the establishment of a representative government, which, given the demographic balance, would have meant an Arab-majority government. The strike lasted 6 months. When it failed to produce concessions, the revolt turned violent. Armed bands, some led by local commanders, others by Syrian and Iraqi volunteers, attacked British military installations, Jewish settlements, and Arab rivals. The rebels briefly controlled significant portions of the countryside. In the old city of Jerusalem, British authority collapsed for a time. The British response was ferocious. Tens of thousands of troops were deployed. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were collectively punished. Houses demolished, livestock confiscated, men detained. The British employed methods that would become familiar in later colonial counterinsurgencies: curfews, checkpoints, mass detention, the destruction of property, and the use of local collaborators. They also armed and trained Jewish auxiliary forces, the Special Night Squads, led by the British officer Ord Wingate, to conduct raids against Arab fighters, providing the Yishuv's paramilitary organizations with military experience and training that would prove invaluable in the coming decades. The revolt was crushed by 1939. The cost was devastating. Approximately 5,000 Arabs were killed, 15,000 wounded, and 5,000 detained. The Arab political leadership was shattered. The Mufti fled to Lebanon, then to Iraq, and eventually to Nazi Germany, where his wartime collaboration with Hitler would permanently taint the Palestinian national movement in the eyes of the world. The Arab economy was damaged. The internal divisions just between clans, between urban notables and rural fighters, between moderates and radicals, were deepened. The military capacity of the Arab community was broken at precisely the moment when it would be most needed. The Jewish community, by contrast, emerged from the revolt period stronger and better organized. The Haganah, the main paramilitary organization, had grown from a part-time militia into a semi-professional force with training, intelligence capabilities, and a rudimentary command structure. The experience of defending settlements under attack had created a siege mentality and a military culture that would shape the coming state. In 1937, amid the revolt, a British commission chaired by Lord Peel proposed for the first time the partition of Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with a continuing British presence in Jerusalem and a corridor to the sea. The proposed Jewish state was small, the coastal plain and the Galilee, but it represented something the Zionist movement had never been officially offered: sovereignty. The Zionist leadership was divided. David Ben-Gurion, emerging as the dominant figure, accepted the principle of partition, while privately noting that a small state could be a starting point for future expansion. The Arab leadership rejected partition categorically. Any division of the land, any recognition of a Jewish political entity on any portion of it, was unacceptable. The Peel Commission's plan was shelved, but the idea of partition, the geometric problem of drawing a line through a land where two populations were intermingled in a pattern that defied any clean separation, had entered the diplomatic vocabulary. It would not leave. The White Paper and the War. In 1939, with war in Europe imminent and Arab unrest still smoldering, the British government issued a white paper that represented a dramatic shift in policy. Jewish immigration would be limited to 75,000 over the next 5 years, after which further immigration would require Arab consent. Land sales to Jews would be restricted. Palestine would move toward independence as a unitary state within 10 years, a state that, given the demographic balance, would be Arab majority. The White Paper was an attempt to appease the Arab world on the eve of a global conflict in which Britain needed Arab and Muslim support. It was a betrayal of the Balfour Declaration in Zionist eyes, and it came at the worst possible moment in Jewish history. In Europe, the catastrophe was unfolding. The Nazi regime had moved from persecution to extermination. Jews desperately seeking to flee Europe found the doors of Palestine, the national home that had been promised to them, closing. Ships carrying Jewish refugees were turned away from Palestinian ports. The Struma, a barely seaworthy vessel carrying 769 Romanian Jews, was refused entry to Palestine in 1942 and sank in the Black Sea after being towed back into open water by Turkish authorities. All but one of the passengers drowned. The British were enforcing immigration restrictions on desperate refugees while the Holocaust was in progress. This is a fact that admits no softening. Whatever the strategic logic, whatever the obligations to the Arab population, the image of British naval vessels intercepting ships full of survivors and routing them to detention camps in Cyprus, or back to the displaced persons camps of Europe, was a moral catastrophe that destroyed whatever legitimacy the mandate still possessed in Jewish eyes. The Yishuv's response was a three-part strategy that Ben-Gurion articulated with characteristic bluntness. We will fight the war as if there were no white paper, and fight the white paper as if there were no war. Jewish volunteers served in the British Army, over 30,000 of them forming the Jewish Brigade that fought in Italy. At the same time, the Haganah organized illegal immigration, Aliyah Bet, smuggling tens of thousands of Jews into Palestine in defiance of British restrictions, and a minority faction, Srin, or the Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, and the even more radical Leahy, led by Avraham Stern, launched a campaign of violence against the British that included assassinations, bombings, and attacks on military and government installations. The most notorious attack came on July 22, 1946, when the Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which housed the British Military Command and the Mandate's central administration. 91 people were killed, British, Arab, and Jewish. The bombing was condemned by the Jewish Agency, though the degree of prior coordination between the agency and the Irgun remains debated. The attack did not end the Mandate, but it accelerated the growing British desire to be rid of the entire problem. Partition. By 1947, Britain was exhausted. The empire was contracting. India was about to be partitioned and released. The Mandate in Palestine had become a burden without benefit, costly in money, in military lives, and in international reputation. In February 1947, the British government announced that it was referring the Palestine question to the newly created United Nations. The UN appointed a special committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, which spent the summer of 1947 touring the territory, interviewing witnesses, and attempting to understand a situation that had defeated 30 years of British administration. The Arab Higher Committee boycotted the committee, a decision that would prove costly. The Jewish Agency cooperated fully, presenting its case with discipline and skill. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on Resolution 181, the partition of Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state, with Jerusalem under international administration. The proposed map was a geometric puzzle of interlocking shapes. The Jewish state would comprise roughly 56% of the land, including the coastal plain, the eastern Galilee, and most of the Negev desert. The Arab state would comprise roughly 43%, the western Galilee, the central highlands, the west bank of the Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. Jerusalem and Bethlehem would form a corpus separatum under international control. The demographics were awkward. The proposed Jewish state would contain roughly 500,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs, a bare and unstable Jewish majority. The proposed Arab state would contain roughly 700,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews. The plan assumed that two states could function side by side with economic union, shared infrastructure, and free movement between them. It was in retrospect unworkable in its specifics. The borders were indefensible. The populations were intermingled. The proposed Jewish state included a near majority of Arabs who had not been consulted and did not consent. The proposed international zone of Jerusalem satisfied no one. The Jewish Agency accepted the plan, not because it was ideal, but because it offered something unprecedented, international recognition of Jewish sovereignty on a portion of the land. Ben-Gurion again saw it as a beginning rather than an end. The Arab leadership rejected it unanimously, categorically, and with a logic that was, from their perspective, internally consistent. The Arabs of Palestine constituted the majority of the population. They had lived on the land for centuries. They had not caused the persecution of Jews in Europe. They did not accept that their land should be partitioned to solve a European problem. And they did not accept that a population that had constituted less than 10% of Palestine's inhabitants 30 years earlier had acquired, through immigration conducted under the protection of a colonial power, the right to sovereignty over more than half the territory. Both positions contained justice. Both contained blindness. The Jewish claim drew on centuries of connection to the land, on the catastrophe of the Holocaust, on the demonstrated capacity to build a functioning society, and on the desperate need for a refuge. The Arab claim drew on the fact of continuous habitation, on the right of a majority population to self-determination, on the injustice of having their fate decided by a distant body in which they had no effective representation, and on the basic principle that immigration does not confer sovereignty. The tragedy, And it is a tragedy in the classical sense, whereas that both claims were legitimate and they could not both be fully satisfied. The land was too small. The populations were too intermingled. The histories were too deep. And the moment had arrived when the contradictions that the mandate had papered over could no longer be deferred. The General Assembly voted. 33 nations voted for partition. 13 voted against. 10 abstained. Britain, the mandatory power, abstained. In Tel Aviv, Jews danced in the streets. In the Arab quarters of Palestine cities, there was fury and dread. The next morning, the shooting started. The Civil War. The period between the UN vote on November 29, 1947, and the British withdrawal on May 14, 1948, was a civil war. A chaotic, violent, and increasingly desperate struggle between the Jewish and Arab communities of Palestine, fought in the absence of any functioning central authority as British forces withdrew incrementally, unwilling to enforce a plan they had not endorsed and eager only to leave. The first months favored the Arabs. Arab militias and volunteer forces, supplemented by fighters from neighboring countries, particularly Syria and Iraq, attacked Jewish settlements and convoys, cut the road to Jerusalem, and besieged the Jewish quarter of the Old City. The Jewish community of 100,000 in Jerusalem faced starvation as the supply route from the coast was interdicted, but the balance shifted. The Haganah mobilized. Arms shipments arrived most critically from Czechoslovakia, which provided rifles, machine guns, and eventually aircraft. In April 1948, the Haganah launched Plan Dalet, a military plan whose purpose and scope remain fiercely debated. The stated goal was to secure the territory allocated to the Jewish state and to establish contiguous control of Jewish-held areas. In practice, it involved the capture of Arab towns and villages, many of which were either within the proposed Jewish state or along the critical supply routes connecting Jewish population centers. What happened during the execution of Plan Dalet is the most contested and consequential aspect of the 1948 war. The Palestinian narrative calls it the Nakba, the catastrophe, and describes a deliberate and systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing in which approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled from their homes through direct military force, massacre, and psychological terror. The traditional Israeli narrative describes a war of survival in which the Arab population fled voluntarily or at the instruction of Arab leaders, and in which Israeli forces acted with restraint under existential threat. The historical evidence, as painstakingly documented by Israeli, Palestinian, and international historians over the past several decades, supports neither narrative in its pure form, though it leans considerably closer to the Palestinian account than the traditional Israeli one. Some Palestinians did flee in panic, without direct contact with Jewish forces. Some were encouraged to leave temporarily by Arab leaders who promised a swift military victory and a triumphant return. But a substantial number, and the evidence for this is now overwhelming, drawn from Israeli military archives, village histories, and survivor testimonies, were expelled by force. Villages were attacked, their populations driven out at gunpoint, their houses demolished to prevent return. In some cases, massacres occurred. The most infamous was Deir Yassin. On April 9, 1948, fighters from the Irgun and Lehi attacked the village of Deir Yassin on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. The village had a non-aggression pact with the nearby Jewish settlement of Givat Shaul. It was not a military target by any reasonable definition. Between 100 and 120 villagers were killed, including women and children. The details of the massacre were broadcast, deliberately by the attackers as a weapon of psychological warfare, and the effect on the Arab population was electric. The name Deir Yassin became a byword for terror, and the fear it generated contributed directly to the flight of Arab civilians from other towns and villages in the weeks that followed. The Haganah leadership condemned Deir Yassin publicly. Whether this condemnation was sincere is a question the evidence does not conclusively answer. What is clear is that the broader pattern of villages emptied, populations displaced, houses destroyed was not the work of rogue militias alone. It was in many cases carried out by Haganah and later Israeli Defense Forces units acting under orders. By the time the British departed on May 14, 1948, approximately 300,000 Palestinians had already been displaced. The remaining 400,000 would follow in the months ahead. The Declaration. On the afternoon of May 14, 1948, in a modest hall in Tel Aviv, the building that had housed the city's art museum, David Ben-Gurion stood beneath a portrait of Theodor Herzl and read the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. In the land of Israel, the Jewish people came into being. In this land was shaped their spiritual, religious, and national character. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. The Declaration invoked history, suffering, international law, and natural right. It promised equality for all inhabitants regardless of religion, race, or sex. It extended a hand of peace to neighboring Arab states. It was signed by 37 members of the provisional government. 11 minutes later, the United States recognized the new state. The Soviet Union followed shortly after. The next morning, 5 Arab armies invaded. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known in Israeli history as the War of Independence and in Palestinian history as the Nakba, lasted roughly 8 months, from May 1948 to March 1949. The Arab forces included armies from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, supplemented by contingents from other Arab states and by Palestinian irregular forces. On paper, the Arab side held overwhelming advantages. In practice, the forces were poorly coordinated, driven by competing national agendas rather than a unified strategy, and hampered by mutual suspicion among their leaders. King Abdullah of Transjordan had secretly negotiated with the Jewish Agency before the war, agreeing to a tacit partition. He would take the Arab areas of Palestine, and the Jewish state would accept his annexation of the West Bank. Egypt and Syria had their own territorial ambitions. The notion of a unified Arab campaign to destroy the Jewish state and restore Palestine to its Arab inhabitants was from the beginning undermined by the fragmentation of Arab politics. The war was fought in several phases, punctuated by UN-brokered truces that both sides used to rearm and reorganize. The initial Arab invasion made gains. The Jordanian Arab Legion, trained and officered by the British, was particularly effective, capturing the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's Old City and holding the West Bank. But the Israeli forces, drawing on the organizational infrastructure of the Yishuv and on the desperate motivation of a community that believed, with reason, that defeat meant annihilation, gradually gained the upper hand. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, separately between Israel and each of the Arab states, the map had been redrawn. Israel controlled not the 56% of Palestine allotted to it by the UN partition plan, but roughly 78%. The remaining 22% was divided. Egypt held the Gaza Strip, and Transjordan annexed the West Bank, including the eastern half of Jerusalem and the Old City. The proposed Palestinian Arab state did not come into existence. No Arab state had fought to create it. No international body had the power or the will to impose it. The Palestinian people, wary, fragmented, displaced, leaderless, were scattered across the region. Approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs had been displaced from their homes. They were in refugee camps in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan. They carried with them the keys to houses that no longer existed, the deeds to land they could not return to, and the memory of villages whose names they would teach their children and their children's children. They called it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Israel called it Hatzmaut, independence, the same events, the same land. Two names for one story that could not be one story because the two peoples living inside it experienced it as opposite things, as birth and as death, as liberation and as dispossession, as the fulfillment of a dream and as the shattering of a world. The armistice lines of 1949, the Green Line, so called because it was drawn in green ink on the map, became the de facto borders of Israel. They were not recognized as permanent boundaries by any party. The Arab states refused to recognize Israel's existence, Israel made no commitment to the partition boundaries it had exceeded. The lines were, by definition, temporary. They held for 18 years. In those 18 years, Israel absorbed nearly 1 million Jewish immigrants, Holocaust survivors from Europe, Jews expelled or pressured to leave from Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Egypt, Libya, and across the Arab world. The Mizrahi Jews, Gir, those from Middle Eastern and North African countries, arrived in a state built largely by European Ashkenazi Jews and found themselves in a society whose cultural assumptions, institutional structures, and hierarchies of prestige did not readily include them. The tensions between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi communities would shape Israeli society for generations. The Palestinian refugees, meanwhile, waited. They waited in camps that were supposed to be temporary, and that became permanent. They waited for the return that had been promised by Arab leaders and enshrined in UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of 1948, which stated that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so. The return did not come. The camps calcified into cities of tin and concrete. Children grew up and had children of their own, and the keys to the old houses were passed from hand to hand like sacred relics. The UN established a dedicated agency, UNRWA, to provide education, health care, and relief to Palestinian refugees. It was meant to be temporary. It still operates today, serving over 5 million registered Palestinian refugees across the region. The refugee population has grown, generation by generation, each one carrying the legal status of refugee, each one inheriting a claim to return to a home that, in most cases, no longer physically exists. This is the core of the conflict, and it has no solution that does not require someone to give up something they consider essential. The Israeli position is that the return of millions of Palestinian refugees would destroy the Jewish character of the state and is therefore impossible. The Palestinian position is that the right of return is inalienable, rooted in international law and in the simple fact that they were expelled from homes that were theirs. Both positions are internally coherent. Both are, in the terms of the other, unacceptable. The land holds both claims. It holds the new neighborhoods built on the ruins of the old villages. It holds the cactus hedges, sabra, the prickly pear, that still mark the boundaries of fields whose owners are in Beirut or Amman, still alive, still remembering. It holds the keys and the deeds and the photographs, carried in wallets and hung on walls and posted on social media by the grandchildren of people who have never set foot on the soil they call home. And it holds the homes of the Israelis who live there now, who built lives and raised children and planted gardens on land they were told was theirs, who cannot be asked to simply leave any more than the Palestinians could be asked to simply forget. This is the knot. It has been pulled tight for 75 years. Every attempt to loosen it has so far only made it tighter. Rest here. The story is not over. The story, in a real sense, has only just begun its most difficult chapter. The wars that follow, 1956, 1967, 1973, are coming. The occupation is coming. The intifadas are coming. The peace processes that promised everything and delivered almost nothing are coming, but not yet. For now, let the armistice lines settle on the map like the creases in a folded cloth. They are not borders. They are not peace. They are a pause, and the pause is all that this land has ever been given between its convulsions. Somewhere in a refugee camp in Gaza, a woman is boiling water over a kerosene stove in a shelter made of corrugated metal. Somewhere in a new apartment in Haifa, a man who arrived from Baghdad with nothing is teaching his daughter to read Hebrew. Somewhere in the old city of Jerusalem, now divided by barbed wire and concrete walls, a shopkeeper is closing his shutters for the night. And the stones of the street are the same stones that have been worn smooth by feet for 3,000 years. The land does not take sides. The land does not remember one story and forget the other. The land holds everything, every prayer, every bullet, every olive tree, every ruin, every cradle, every grave. It is holding them now. It will hold them tomorrow. The wars are coming. Let them wait a little longer. Part 7. the unfinished land. The wars did not wait long. In 1956, Israel joined Britain and France in an invasion of Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Israeli forces swept across the Sinai Peninsula in 100 hours, reaching the canal before American and Soviet pressure forced a withdrawal. The campaign demonstrated Israel's military capability. It also demonstrated the limits of that capability. The great powers would not permit unilateral conquest, and Israel returned the Sinai without having gained anything permanent except confidence. Nasser, despite his military defeat, emerged as a political victor. He had defied the old colonial powers and survived. Across the Arab world, he became the symbol of a new politics, Pan-Arabism, the vision of a unified Arab nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf, freed from colonial borders and Western domination. For Palestinians, Nasser represented hope that the Arab states would eventually muster the collective will to reverse 1948. The hope was genuine. It was also, as events would prove, misplaced. The decade between 1956 and 1967 was a period of mounting tension and rhetorical escalation. Arab leaders competed with one another in the extravagance of their promises to liberate Palestine. Radio Cairo broadcast fiery speeches. Syria shelled Israeli settlements from the Golan Heights. Palestinian Fedayeen, guerrilla fighters, launched raids across the armistice lines. Israel retaliated with escalating force. The region moved toward war with the grinding inevitability of tectonic plates. In May 1967, Nasser ordered UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai, moved Egyptian troops to the Israeli border, and closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, an act Israel had declared it would treat as a casus belli. Syria and Jordan signed mutual defense pacts with Egypt. Arab radio promised the destruction of the Jewish state. The populations of the Arab capitals celebrated in the streets. The population of Israel dug trenches in public parks and prepared for what many believed would be a second Holocaust. On the morning of June 5th, 1967, Israel struck first. Stories. 6 days. The Six-Day War was one of the most decisive military campaigns in modern history. In fewer than 6 hours on the first morning, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Nearly 300 aircraft, the backbone of Arab military power, demolished before their pilots could reach them. With air superiority secured, Israeli ground forces advanced on 3 fronts simultaneously. In the south, Israeli armor swept across the Sinai for the second time in 11 years, reaching the Suez Canal in 3 days. In the north, Israeli forces stormed the Golan Heights, capturing the fortified Syrian plateau in 2 days of fierce fighting. And in the center, the front that would prove most consequential, Israeli forces attacked the Jordanian positions in Jerusalem and the West Bank. King Hussein of Jordan had been warned through secret channels not to enter the war. He entered anyway, bound by the defense pact with Egypt and by the political impossibility of sitting out a conflict that was being framed as the final reckoning with Israel. Jordanian artillery shelled West Jerusalem. Israeli forces responded with a full-scale assault on East Jerusalem, the Old City, and the entire West Bank. On June 7th, Israeli paratroopers fought their way through the narrow streets of the Old City and reached the Western Wall, the last remnant of Herod's temple platform, the site where Jews had prayed and wept for centuries when they were permitted to, and from which they had been barred since 1948. The radio transmission of the moment, "The Temple Mount is in our hands," became one of the most iconic phrases in Israeli history. Soldiers who had never been religious stood before the ancient stones and cried. In 6 days, Israel had tripled the territory under its control. It held the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. It controlled, for the first time, the entire land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. The territory that both peoples claimed, the territory that the partition plan had sought to divide, the territory that was once again under a single sovereign authority. 1 million Palestinians who had been living under Jordanian and Egyptian rule were now under Israeli military occupation. The war's speed was stunning. Its consequences are still unfolding. The occupation. The word itself is contested, as every word in this conflict is contested. Israel has never formally accepted the term occupation for its presence in the West Bank, preferring administered territories or disputed territories. International law, as interpreted by the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, and the vast majority of the world's states, considers the territories occupied and the Israeli settlements built upon them illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention. What is not disputed is what happened on the ground. In the immediate aftermath of the 1967 war, Israel faced a decision that would define the next half-century of its existence: what to do with the conquered territories and the people living in them. 3 broad options existed: annex the territories and grant their Palestinian inhabitants citizenship, which would create a binational state and end the Jewish demographic majority; return the territories in exchange for peace, which would require Arab willingness to negotiate, something that was not forthcoming in 1967, or hold the territories indefinitely under military administration while settling Israeli civilians on the land. A policy that would create facts on the ground while deferring the political question. Israel chose the third path, or rather, it chose not to choose, allowing settlement to proceed incrementally, driven by religious conviction, security arguments, and domestic politics, without ever making a definitive decision about the ultimate disposition of the territories. The settlement project began almost immediately. In September 1967, the first Jewish settlement was established at Kfar Etzion in the West Bank, on the site of a community that had existed before 1948 and been destroyed in the war. Within months, settlements appeared in the Jordan Valley, in the Golan Heights, in the Sinai, and in the heart of Hebron. The religious settler movement, Gush Eminim, the Bloc of the Faithful, provided the ideological energy, drawing on a theology that regarded the territories as the biblical heartland of Israel, divinely promised and not subject to negotiation. Successive Israeli governments, whether Labor or Likud, whether nominally supportive or nominally opposed to settlement expansion, permitted or actively encouraged the process. By the early 21st century, the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem had surpassed 600,000. The settlements, connected by a network of roads, protected by military checkpoints, supported by infrastructure that drew water and electricity from the territory around them, had fragmented the West Bank into a patchwork of disconnected enclaves. The map of the West Bank today resembles an archipelago, islands of Palestinian authority surrounded by a sea of Israeli military and civil control. For the Palestinian population living under occupation, the daily reality was and is defined by restriction. Movement between towns requires passage through checkpoints where delays can last hours. Construction of homes requires permits that are rarely granted. Agricultural land can be confiscated for settlement expansion or military use. Water resources are disproportionately allocated to settlements. Arrest and detention without trial, administrative detention, is routine. The military court system that governs Palestinian life in the occupied territories has a conviction rate exceeding 99%. This is the reality that Palestinians describe as apartheid, a system of differential legal regimes applied to two populations living on the same land, in which one population has full rights and the other has almost none. The comparison is rejected by Israel and many of its supporters, who argue that the situation is one of temporary military necessity driven by ongoing security threats, not racial supremacy. The debate over terminology is fierce and unsettled. The facts on the ground are less ambiguous than the language used to describe them. The struggles. The Palestinian national movement, shattered in 1948, reconstituted itself in exile. The Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964, came under the leadership of Yasser Arafat in 1969 and pursued a strategy that combined diplomacy, armed struggle, and international advocacy. The PLO's early operations included airline hijackings, attacks on Israeli civilians, and the 1972 massacre of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, acts that brought international attention to the Palestinian cause while simultaneously associating it with terrorism in the minds of much of the world. The moral calculus of political violence in the context of occupation and dispossession is not a question this narration can resolve. What can be said is that the violence was real. The suffering it caused was real on both sides, and the cycle of attack and retaliation that defined the decades after 1967 created a feedback loop of trauma that hardened both populations against the possibility of compromise. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The early hours were catastrophic for Israel. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and overwhelmed the Bar-Lev line, while Syrian tanks nearly broke through on the Golan Heights. For the first time since 1948, the existence of the state seemed genuinely threatened. Israel mobilized its reserves, counterattacked, and eventually turned the tide, crossing the Suez Canal into Egypt and encircling the Egyptian Third Army. But the war shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Israeli military since 1967. The 1973 war's most lasting consequence was not military but diplomatic. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat, having restored Egyptian honor on the battlefield, pivoted to negotiation. In 1977, he flew to Jerusalem, an act of staggering political courage, and addressed the Israeli Knesset. In 1978, at Camp David, with American President Jimmy Carter mediating, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin negotiated a peace agreement. Israel returned the Sinai to Egypt. Egypt recognized Israel. The treaty held. Sadat was assassinated by Egyptian Islamists in 1981 for making it. Camp David demonstrated that peace was possible between Israel and an Arab state. It also demonstrated the limits of that peace. The agreement addressed Egyptian-Israeli relations. It did not address the Palestinian question. The Palestinians, the people at the center of the conflict, were not at the table. The autonomy provisions that the Camp David Accords included for the West Bank and Gaza were never implemented. In December 1987, the Palestinians under occupation rose. The first Intifada, Diwar, the Arabic word means shaking off, was a largely spontaneous popular uprising that began in the Gaza Strip and spread rapidly to the West Bank. Its weapons were stones, tires, strikes, boycotts, and the sheer collective refusal of a population to continue submitting quietly. Young Palestinians, many of them born under occupation, knowing no other reality, confronted Israeli soldiers with rocks and slingshots. The images, uniformed soldiers firing at unarmed teenagers, were broadcast worldwide and transformed international perception of the conflict. Israel's response was harsh. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin reportedly ordered soldiers to break their bones. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed, thousands were detained, houses were demolished, curfews were imposed on entire towns for weeks at a time. The measures suppressed the uprising but did not end it, and the political cost, in international opinion, in Israeli self-image, in the morale of soldiers ordered to police a civilian population, was severe. The Intifada also transformed Palestinian politics. The PLO, based in distant Tunis since its expulsion from Lebanon in 1982, struggled to control a movement driven by local leaders inside the territories. And a new force emerged, Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, founded in 1987 as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas rejected the secular nationalism of the PLO and framed the conflict in religious terms. Not a struggle over borders, but a struggle over sacred land, not amenable to compromise. Its charter called for the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic state in all of Palestine. It provided social services, schools, clinics, welfare, that the Palestinian Authority could not, building a base of support among the impoverished population of Gaza that would prove durable. The existence of Hamas served multiple functions in the conflict's political ecology. For Israel, it justified the argument that there was no partner for peace. For the PLO, it created pressure to negotiate before its own relevance was eclipsed. For the Palestinian population, it offered an alternative to a national movement that had produced decades of struggle and no tangible results. The peace that wasn't. In September 1993, on the White House lawn, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shook hands. The handshake, visibly reluctant on Rabin's part, theatrically eager on Arafat's, was the culmination of months of secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway, and it appeared to herald the end of the century-long conflict. The Oslo Accords established a framework for Palestinian self-governance in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. A Palestinian Authority was created with Arafat as its president. Israeli forces withdrew from major Palestinian population centers. The difficult issues, the final borders, the status of Jerusalem, the future of settlements, the right of return for refugees, were deferred to final status negotiations that were supposed to be completed within 5 years. The 5 years passed, the final status negotiations never succeeded. The reasons are debated with the same intensity as every other aspect of this conflict. The Israeli perspective emphasizes Arafat's unwillingness to accept generous offers, his failure to stop terrorism, and the continued incitement in Palestinian media and education. The Palestinian perspective emphasizes the continued expansion of settlements during the peace process. The number of settlers doubled between 1993 and 2000, the fragmentation of Palestinian territory into disconnected zones, the humiliation of checkpoints and permits that persisted despite the supposed peace, and the inadequacy of Israeli offers that left the Palestinians with a non-contiguous state lacking sovereignty over its borders, airspace, or water resources. In July 2000, at a second Camp David summit, President Bill Clinton brought Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak together for a final attempt. The negotiations failed. Who was responsible for the failure is a question that has generated a library of competing accounts and that cannot be answered definitively here. What followed was the Second Intifada, far more violent than the first. Suicide bombings struck Israeli buses, restaurants, and shopping centers, killing hundreds of civilians. Israel reoccupied the West Bank, besieged Arafat in his compound in Ramallah, and began construction of a separation barrier, a wall in many sections, that cut deep into the West Bank, separating Palestinian villages from their farmland, Palestinian workers from their jobs, and any remaining Palestinian territory from geographical coherence. The Second Intifada killed approximately 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis between 2000 and 2005. It destroyed what remained of the Israeli peace movement's political influence. It entrenched the conviction on the Israeli side that there was no partner for peace, and that security required physical separation and military dominance. It entrenched the conviction on the Palestinian side that negotiation was futile, and that the peace process had been a mechanism for deepening the occupation rather than ending it. Arafat died in November 2004, besieged and diminished, in a French military hospital. The cause of death has never been definitively established. The fracture deepens. In 2005, Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, the general who had led the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the politician who had championed settlement construction for decades, ordered the unilateral withdrawal of Israeli settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip. The move was traumatic for the settler movement, which saw it as a betrayal, and puzzling to many observers who could not reconcile it with Sharon's lifelong record. Sharon suffered a massive stroke in January 2006 and never regained consciousness, taking whatever strategic vision had motivated the withdrawal into silence with him. In 2006, Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections, a result that surprised Hamas itself, embarrassed the Palestinian Authority, and horrified Israel and its Western allies. The elections were, by international consensus, free and fair. Their result was not accepted. International aid was cut. A power struggle between Hamas and Fatah, the party of Arafat and his successor, Mahmoud Abbas, escalated into armed conflict. By By 2007, Hamas controlled Gaza and Fatah controlled the West Bank. The Palestinian National Movement was split in two. Gaza, under Hamas control and Israeli blockade, became what many observers described as the world's largest open-air prison, a strip of land 40 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, home to over 2 million people, most of them refugees or descendants of refugees from 1948, sealed on all sides by Israeli and Egyptian barriers with movement of people and goods controlled by Israel. The blockade was justified by Israel as necessary to prevent Hamas from acquiring weapons. Its effect on the civilian population was devastating. Shortages of food, medicine, fuel, and building materials, unemployment rates exceeding 50%, a water system on the verge of collapse, electricity available for only a few hours a day. Periodic eruptions of violence became the rhythm of Gaza's existence. Hamas and other groups fired rockets into southern Israel, crude, inaccurate, but terrifying to the civilian populations in their range. Israel responded with military operations of increasing destructiveness, Operation Cast Lead in 2008 to 2009, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, each killing hundreds or thousands of Palestinian civilians, each failing to resolve the underlying situation, each generating international condemnation that Israel dismissed and domestic support that its leaders relied upon. The West Bank, under the Palestinian Authority and continued Israeli military occupation, experienced a different but parallel stagnation. Settlement expansion continued. The separation barrier solidified. The political horizon contracted. Abbas, aging and increasingly authoritarian, postponed elections indefinitely. A generation of Palestinians grew up under occupation with no memory of the peace process and no expectation of its revival. A generation of Israelis grew up with the occupation as an invisible background condition. Invisible because the wall worked, because the checkpoints kept Palestinian laborers out of sight, because the settlements were connected by roads that bypassed Palestinian towns entirely, creating a parallel geography in which the occupation could be experienced as an abstraction. October. On the morning of October 7, 2023, Hamas fighters breached the barrier surrounding Gaza and attacked communities in southern Israel. The assault was unprecedented in its scale and its brutality. Approximately 1,200 people were killed, the largest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust. Civilians were murdered in their homes at a music festival in kibbutzim, whose residents had, in many cases, been advocates for peace and coexistence. Over 200 hostages were taken into Gaza. The attack shattered assumptions. It shattered the assumption that the barrier and the technological surveillance system surrounding Gaza made Israel secure. It shattered the assumption that Hamas could be managed, contained, deterred. It shattered the assumption that the conflict could be indefinitely deferred, that Israel could maintain the occupation and the blockade and the settlement project while the world's attention moved elsewhere. Israel's response was massive. The military campaign in Gaza that followed was, by any measure, one of the most destructive in modern urban warfare. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hospitals, schools, mosques, and refugee shelters were struck. The civilian death toll mounted into the tens of thousands. The population of Gaza, already besieged, already impoverished, already traumatized by decades of blockade and periodic bombardment, was subjected to conditions that international organizations described in terms that the Israeli government rejected, and that the evidence on the ground made difficult to dispute. The images from Gaza, the collapsed buildings, the children pulled from rubble, the hospitals without electricity, the families fleeing on foot with nowhere to flee to, were broadcast to a world that was, depending on where you stood, horrified by the scale of destruction or convinced of its necessity. The images from October 7th, the burned houses, the bodies at the festival, the hostage videos, were broadcast to a world that was, depending on where you stood, horrified by the barbarity or contextualized as the inevitable product of decades of blockade and occupation. Both horrors were real. Both sets of victims were real. The dead on both sides were equally dead. The grief of an Israeli mother and the grief of a Palestinian mother are made of the same material, and any account of this conflict that ranks one above the other has ceased to be history and become propaganda. We will not do that here. What we will say is that the events of October 2023 and their aftermath exposed with terrible clarity the bankruptcy of every framework that had been applied to this conflict for the previous 30 years. The peace process was dead. The two-state solution, still endorsed by diplomats, had been rendered geographically implausible by the settlement enterprise. The one-state alternatives, whether democratic or authoritarian, were rejected by both sides for reasons that were existential rather than negotiable. Management of the conflict among the strategy of indefinite deferral and had produced October 7th. The land remained, the people remained, the claims remained, the dead accumulated, the living endured. What remains? Let us return now to where we began. The land between the river and the sea is still roughly 150 miles from north to south and 70 miles from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. It is still smaller than Belgium. It is still a sliver, a margin, a hinge between continents. The spring at Jericho still flows as it flowed when the first settlers built their tower beside it 11,000 years ago. The terraced hillsides of the Central Highlands still hold the soil, though many of the terraces are crumbling now, untended by the farmers who built them, and were separated from them by walls and checkpoints and the accumulated weight of the centuries' decisions. The olive trees still stand. Some of them are very old, gnarled, split, hollowed by the centuries, still producing fruit. Palestinian farmers speak of trees that have been in their families for generations, for longer than anyone can count. Israeli settlers have planted new orchards on hilltops that were empty a decade ago. The trees do not know whose hands tend them. They know the soil, the rain, the sun. That is enough. The sources we discussed at the beginning of this story, the archaeological remains, the ancient texts, the administrative records, the overwhelming modern archive, continue to grow. New excavations uncover new layers, new documents are declassified, new testimonies are recorded. The Israeli historian Benny Morris opened Israeli military archives in the 1980s and revealed, to the discomfort of both sides, a more complicated picture of 1948 than either national narrative had admitted. Palestinian oral history projects have preserved the memories of the Nakba generation before they pass entirely into silence. Every year, the evidentiary base grows. Every year, the interpretive disagreements persist. This is one of the paradoxes of Palestine. More information does not produce more consensus. The facts are not in dispute in most cases. The meaning of the facts is in dispute in every case. The same archaeological stratum can be cited to support competing claims of precedence. The same document can be read as evidence of ethnic cleansing or of military necessity. The same event can be a massacre or a battle, a liberation or an occupation, a founding or a destruction, depending on where you stand and whose dead you are counting. We have tried, across the length of this narration, to hold the stereoscope steady, to look at this land with both eyes open, to see the cathedral and the ruin in the same frame. Whether we have succeeded is not for us to judge. The attempt was honest. The silences we have acknowledged are real. The voices we have failed to include, and there are many, there are always many, deserve their own tellings by their own tellers in their own time. The Coda. There is a hillside in the Central Highlands, not far from Nablus, where the limestone breaks through the thin soil in pale shelves, and wild thyme grows in the cracks. And in spring the red anemones come up so thick that the slope looks, from a distance, like it is bleeding. This hill has been farmed probably for 8,000 years. It has been terraced and planted and harvested by people who spoke languages that no longer exist, who worshipped gods whose names are lost, who were conquered and absorbed and reconquered and absorbed again. It has been Canaanite land and Israelite land and Babylonian land and Persian land and Greek land and Roman land and Byzantine land and Arab land and Crusader land and Mamluk land and Ottoman land and British land and Jordanian land and Israeli-occupied land. It has been all of these things, and it has been none of them, because the hill does not belong to any of these categories. The hill belongs to the geological processes that made it and the rain that falls on it and the roots that hold it together. The people who have lived on this hill have left almost nothing that we can read. They left terraces. They left olive presses carved into bedrock. They left the faint traces of threshing floors, circular depressions in the stone where wheat was separated from chaff by the hooves of animals walking in endless circles, season after season, century after century. They left no declarations of ownership. They left no manifestos. They left no claims that could be adjudicated by any court of law. They left the work of their hands in the stone, and the stone remains after every army has passed and every flag has been lowered and every speech has been forgotten. This is what Palestine is beneath the layers of claim and counterclaim, beneath the diplomacy and the violence and the grief. It is a place where people have worked stone and soil for longer than almost anywhere else on earth. It is a place where the human project of settling down, of choosing a spot and staying, of planting and building and burying the dead and teaching the children, began. That woman kneeling in the Jordan Valley 10,000 years ago, pressing a seed into the brown earth, was not making a political statement. She was making a life. The people who live on this land today, all of them Israeli and Palestinian, Jewish and Muslim and Christian, settler and refugee, soldier and farmer, are making lives. They are raising children in a landscape that is dense with memory and volatile with grief. They are baking bread and arguing with their neighbors and watching the light change on stone walls as the people of this land have always done. They are capable of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty as the people of this land have always been. They are trapped in a story they did not start and cannot end. And the only thing more painful than living inside it would be abandoning it entirely, which neither side can do because the land is in them as surely as they are on it. The conflict will not be resolved by narration. It will not be resolved by understanding, though understanding is better than ignorance. It will not be resolved by assigning blame, though blame can be assigned in abundance to every party that has ever held power here. If it is resolved, it will be resolved by people who are not yet born, making decisions we cannot foresee under circumstances we cannot predict, with a courage that our current moment does not provide. Until then, the land endures. It endures the walls built across it. It endures the bombs that fall on it. It endures the prayers said over it in 3 languages. It endures the maps drawn upon it by distant hands. It endures because land has no choice but to endure, and because the soil does not care who holds the deed, and because the rain falls on the just and the unjust, and because the olive trees go on producing fruit for whoever tends them, and because the spring at Jericho has not stopped flowing in 11,000 years and will not stop tomorrow. The light is fading now. The sky over Jerusalem is doing what it does at dusk, turning from pale blue to gold to a violet so deep it approaches black, the same progression it has performed every evening since before there were eyes to see it. The stones of the old city are warm from the day's sun. They will cool through the night and warm again in the morning. They have been doing this for longer than any empire, any religion, any name that has been given to this place. Somewhere a child is falling asleep to the sound of wind through olive trees. The land is here. The land is patient. The land will be here when the rest of us are finished with our noise. Rest now. The stones are warm. The wind is gentle. The story goes on as it always has, as it will, quietly, beneath the sound of everything we cannot stop arguing about, in the slow turning of seasons, in the patient work of roots in rocky soil, in the ancient, undiscouraged persistence of seeds.